Handle now 83.06, up 0.5%. This morning, a new round of inflation data following yesterday's hopeful report on consumer prices. And with that story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
The Producer Price Index, the PPI, rose in June, topping Wall Street estimates. Hold on, though. Paul Ashworth at Capital Economics says it's a lot better than it looks. He notes specific PPI data that feed into the Federal Reserve's preferred measure of inflation seem rather benign. We get that data. It's called the PCE in 2 weeks. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
Big bank earnings this morning. Shares of Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup all lower after earnings. Wells Fargo is down 6.7%. JP Morgan Chase down 0.4%. Citigroup down 2.8%. Boeing, meanwhile, notifying some 737 MAX customers in recent weeks that aircraft due for delivery in 2025 and 2026 face additional delays. Boeing shares today down 1.6%. Rival Airbus up by 0.9% on the U.S. ADRs. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you so much, Charlie Pellet. I'm Alex Steele. Alongside John Tucker, Paul Sweeney is on the beach. I bet you it's cold on the beach, don't you think?
It has been surprisingly cold on the beach when you get that southerly wind blowing off the water. And I was sandblasted the other day. The wind was blowing so hard.
Rude.
And I had, despite the fact that it felt like 100 degrees inland, the heat index, I was wearing a hooded sweatshirt on the beach. That's how chilly it was.
Yeah, that's crazy. And then now it's raining. It's a little bit misty. Sorry, Paul. You know, those Fridays in the summer, they're not working for you right now. All right, let's get to some of the news here, and that is NATO over the last few days. President Biden, of course, had that news conference yesterday. We had Jens Stoltenberg, the outgoing NATO head, speaking to Bloomberg earlier, talking about how he expects the U.S. will remain a strong NATO ally. Of course, who wins the presidential election will have a lot to do with that. So we want to check in with Dr. Ariel Cohen, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He joins us now. Dr. Cohen, what is my NATO takeaway right now over the last few days?
First of all, this was a celebratory meeting of the 75th anniversary, and I think NATO is getting a little bit long in the tooth. It is not facing the real challenges. I would like to see much more vigorous leadership there that you and I may agree or disagree whether President Biden provided it, but more importantly, we see a lot of redundancies in NATO procurement. We see shortages of equipment and materiel. We see shortages of soldiers, of grunts on the ground in Europe. But on the other hand, we also saw for the first time NATO expressing grave concerns about China supporting Russia. So NATO is increasingly a global alliance led by the United States. And President Biden, if elected, will be ill-advised to discard NATO. We all are aware of his pessimism about NATO, his rhetoric about NATO.
You mean Donald Trump, right?
I'm sorry, Donald Trump, of course.
Okay.
So Trump will be ill-advised to discard NATO in the era of confrontation with Russia and serious friction with China. We need our allies, coalitions, and industrial potential win wars. We saw it in the 20th century, World War I, World War II. The allies had a bigger and stronger coalition and industrial base in World War I and World War II.
Has NATO been able to Trump-proof itself?
NATO is not sufficiently Trump-proofing. If by Trump-proofing we mean the U.S. that disconnects from Europe or focuses on China, as some experts in Washington suggested, just forget Europe, let Putin have Ukraine, let's all focus on the Pacific. This is not the way to go, but Europe has multiple models of fighter aircraft that don't have strategic bombers. They have multiple models of main battle tanks and insufficient production of 155 millimeter shells, not enough missiles, although they're capable of producing the missiles and the drones we need in today's world. The production is shifting. It's no longer these single, very over-engineered, very expensive platforms that think F-35s, F-22s, think the Sentinel ICBMs. We need mass production of cheap drones, and this is something China may excel in. The warfare is shifting. We need a balance between the sophisticated and expensive systems and mass-produced drones.
I mean, that's a fascinating point, the cheaper drones, but even in that area, you have some of the big technology companies in the U.S., because of political pressures, refusing to go down that route. And certainly the U.S. defense industry may not have the wherewithal in terms of spending to develop the drones that could potentially be a big threat to the structure that we now have in place.
Well, think about the current naval structure: 12 tabletops, aircraft carriers, flat tops. Each one costs billions and billions of dollars and many more billions to protect, and can be taken out by a swarm of drones, even to go into sci-fi area that ceases to be sci-fi. An AI-controlled swarm of drones taking out an aircraft carrier. Think about the consequences: 6,000 plus sailors and soldiers on that aircraft carrier, and massive escalation in the Pacific, for example. Think about these $2,000 drone taking out a $2 million tank in Europe. Ukrainians are planning to produce 1 million drones. The Russians are planning to produce 2 million drones. And now Russians are getting technology from unexpected sources like Iran and North Korea. And China, by the way. This is the reason for NATO mentioning China so sternly and severely in the NATO document. So the shift of warfare and production is moving very fast. And I'm not convinced that the Pentagon has the procurement procedures that are broken. I'm in Washington, D.C. I'm doing it for a living. I talk to people who know the Pentagon procurement in and out, inside out. And they are complaining that the procurement system is broken. And because of the revolving doors with the military-industrial complex, the generals are not ordering the cheap systems the military-industrial complex doesn't want, because they're not making as much money on cheaper drones vis-a-vis F-35s.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just want to add that Peter Thiel, no matter what you think of the investor, he's kind of taken up the slack in terms of investing in small startups that specialize in these advanced drones. So there's a lot of attention being paid to that because it's just not coming from other avenues. And that seems to be, as Dr. Cohen just mentioned, one of the big threats we're facing, especially in the Pacific with the fleets, the carrier fleets. So take that for what it's worth.
I will take a lot for what it's worth when it comes to you, John Tucker and Dr. Ariel Cohen. We also appreciate your time today as well, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. I don't feel better about where we are now in the global sphere, but that's how it goes. More coming up. This is Bloomberg Intelligence.
company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Big banks out with earnings. JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Citigroup all trading lower. Citigroup said costs for the year are now likely to be at the high end of the range it previously provided after the bank faced a series of regulatory penalties in recent months. Gerard Cassidy is head of U.S. Bank Equity Strategy at RBC Capital Markets.
Citigroup's a turnaround story. As you know, they've struggled over the years, and Jane Fraser is now simplifying the franchise, trying to streamline it, trying to make it more profitable. She's making good progress, a long way to go. But JP Morgan has been a fine-tuned machine for a number of years under the leadership of Jamie Dimon. And those numbers show out as we're seeing today. They're very strong in, as you know, investment banking, capital markets, but they have the diversified revenue stream that is quite positive with the consumer business and the wealth management business as well.
RBC's Gerard Cassidy interviewed on Bloomberg Surveillance. Shares of Citigroup down now by 1.5%. JP Morgan Chase reported record profit as investment bankers and equities traders at the biggest American bank smashed expectations, and the firm took a multi-billion-dollar gain tied to a Visa share exchange. Right now, JP Morgan Chase down 0.1%, lower little changed. Wells Fargo, different story, down now by 6.8%. Wells Fargo is warning it will not be able to cut costs as fast as it previously forecast this year after the banking giant posted higher than expected expenses in the second quarter. Novo Nordisk's Ozempic has been linked to lower rates of dementia and a range of other mental problems in a University of Oxford study that raises expectations about the diabetes drug's potential other benefits. Those are our top company stories. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
Happy Friday, everybody. I'm Alex Steele alongside John Tucker. Paul Sweeney is off today. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We are broadcasting to you live from the Interactive Broker Studio right here in Midtown Manhattan. You can also check us out on YouTube. We give you all the news that you need, and we also give you the world and national news. For that, we go to Michael Barr. Michael?
Alex, John, Charlie, thank you very much. President Joe Biden heads back to the campaign trail. Today, he will hold a rally in the swing state of Michigan. Yesterday, Biden vowed he would remain in the 2024 presidential race. But two notable flubs deepened concerns about his mental acuity that threatened his campaign. The president drew gasps when he mistakenly introduced Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky as Russian President Vladimir Putin at an event in the late afternoon.
And now I want to hand it over to the president of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. We're going to beat President Putin. President Zelensky.
Then, at the opening of the press conference, he called Vice President Kamala Harris Vice President Trump. Wendy Schiller, director of the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy at Brown University, says, though, she does not think the news conference was damaging.
Does he show that he's older? Yes, he does. But did he show that he had a pretty strong grasp of international relations, geopolitics? Yes, he did. You know, you ask yourself, would Donald Trump have been able to answer the questions for the same period of time with the same clarity, maybe not clearly, speech-wise, but knowledge-based? And the answer is probably no, that Donald Trump wouldn't have answered those questions the same way and wouldn't have been able to.
Wendy Schiller of Brown University. And just a few moments ago, President Biden sent out a message on X, formerly Twitter. He was talking about Israel. He said, 6 weeks ago, I'd laid out a comprehensive framework for how to achieve a ceasefire and bring the hostages home. There is still work to do, and these are complex issues, but that framework is now agreed to by both Israel and Hamas. Former President Donald Trump met with Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who traveled to Florida from the NATO summit. The Hungarian leader posted a photo with the Republican nominee at his Mar-a-Lago resort, showing the pair giving a thumbs up. Orban is the closest EU leader to Russia. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. Back to Alex, John, and Charlie.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael Barr. So we're here 5 days a week. But, John, if we ever get to a point where they let us go 4 days a week, this is what we can do. We can go to the French Riviera. and just
can we?
broadcast from there. So apparently affluent Americans, so maybe not me
Okay,
and
but
John.
you just excluded us. then.
I know.
What
I
do you
said
mean
maybe
we
not
can-
us.
No,
but
we can't do this.
One can dream.
We're going to the
One
Poconos.
can dream. Hey, that's something. Affluent Americans with the flexibility to work remotely are now snapping up luxury houses on the French Riviera. Prices of homes that have been valued about $16 million, 15 million euros, along France's southeastern coast rose between 15 and 20% in the 5 years through 2023, outperforming 13% gains in London in the same period. Thank you, data from Beauchamp Estates.
Okay, but there were like these elections and like Marine Le Pen and whatever. How does that change the landscape?
Well, I mean, if you're domiciled here, but you have a house there that you live
You
in
don't
for a little
care
while,
about French
do you
politics?
care? I don't know if you care. Do you? Would we?
Here's
If we were broadcasting from the French Riviera and overlooking the ocean right now, and we have a mimosa next to us or like a rosé, I don't think you'd care.
Okay. I'm just gonna say because I'm a beach person, from my perspective, here's my problem with the French Riviera. You go to the beach, it's rocky. It's like little pebbles. It's not sand. Do I have that right?
I don't know. I've never been there. We're not affluent Americans.
You guys make me sick. I live in the Poconos, and you're telling me I can't stand living on the French Riviera.
I did not say that.
No, I did. I'm just comparing beaches. I just, it's nice, I guess.
Those rocks between my toes, I just can't stand that, Thurston.
Okay, so instead of looking at the French Riviera, we'll just look out at the Jersey Shore in the sand and do our
Michael
shows
Barr's
from there.
basement in the Poconos.
These are all goals. All right, wraps it up for me and John, guys. Have a great weekend. Balance of Power is up next with
fun.
Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
Joe Biden follows last night's news conference with actual news. A framework for a ceasefire now agreed to by both Israel and Hamas. This headline just breaking in Washington. Welcome to the fastest show in politics. Live from the Capitol with continued questions about Joe Biden's political future. We're joined this hour by Republican strategist Lisa Camuso-Miller and Democratic strategist Jim Kessler from Third Way with analysis from our signature panel. They were with us last night for the Newser, back with us today on Balance of Power. Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributors, and it's all after a look at Wall Street. Let's get up to date on Friday markets right now with Charlie Pellet in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Thank you very much, Joe Matthew. We are looking at records right now. We've got the S&P 500 index advancing. It is at 56.27 on the S&P, pulling back from a record just a couple of points below, up 42 right now, a gain of just about 0.8%. The Dow definitely at a record, 40,066, up 312 right now. That is a gain of just about 0.8%, while NASDAQ is advancing 158, up by 0.9%. And building on yesterday's theme, we have got the Russell 2000 index of small cap shares also building on yesterday's gains. The Russell 2000 up by another 1.2%. 10-year, 4.19%, with a 2-year, 4.47%. Spot gold now retreating by 0.1%, 24.12 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.1%, 82.72 for a barrel of WTI. Stocks rose, bond yields fell with the latest economic readings, reinforcing speculation that the Fed will be able to cut rates as early as September. Right now, we do have Wall Street penciling cuts for September, but then, of course, there is the election. Mohamed Al-Arian is the former CEO of PIMCO, currently the president of Queens College, Cambridge, and a Bloomberg opinion columnist.
What does the politics look like when we get to September, and how worried are they that there's going to be an inflationary shock coming after the elections due to policies? So it's not as simple as saying, well, the market thinks it's over 80% probability is going to happen, because this Fed is very impacted by high frequency indicators.
Mohammed Al-Arian, president of Queen's College, Cambridge. Again, stocks higher across the board. One notable exception, the three big banks that reported this morning, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, all in the red after earnings. Of course, more big banks next week. Right now, JP Morgan Chase down 0.6%, Citigroup lower by 1%, and Wells Fargo down now by 0.6%. Recapping, stocks higher, the S&P again flirting with records, up 43 right now, up by about 0.8%. Balance of power continues. Lots going on in Washington. Once again, your host, here he is, Joe Matthew.
From here to there, Charlie, you know it, my friend. Thank you and happy Friday. Charlie Pellet will be back with more on the markets as we work our way through, beginning of earnings reporting season. We have got so much going on here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube. We're going to jam it all into the fastest show in politics. As we look to Twitter, I still call it Twitter, where Joe Biden is making news this morning. Just hours, my God, what is it, 12 hours after the end of this news conference and change last evening. A little bleary-eyed today in Washington. How do you think the president feels? Pretty good, based on what we're hearing from the White House, the campaign, and now this. At POTUS 6 weeks ago, I laid out a comprehensive framework for how to achieve a ceasefire and bring the hostages home. Let's just stop right there. It's just a 3-line tweet. That was 6 Fridays ago, May 31st, when it kind of sounded like we had a ceasefire agreed to. Of course, fighting has not stopped in Gaza. Fast forward 6. He says there's still a lot of work to do, and these are complex issues. But that framework is now agreed to by both Israel and Hamas. My team, he says, is making progress, and I am determined to get there. So we add another wrinkle to the story in what many here are calling in Washington purgatory. Did he clear the hurdle last night? Yeah, apparently. Enough. Pretty low expectations, low bar. Enough to not convince more lawmakers to call for him to drop out. And we've had a couple. Jim Hines had his statement written, it looked like, before the news conference was even done. He kicked it out 5 minutes after they were there. Did you see the news conference? Maybe you listened to it. It's different experience depending on how you consume the event. It went 59 minutes. President had a list of reporters, including Bloomberg's Josh Wingrove, to call on, and he made his intentions clear on this race. Once again, here's Joe Biden from last night.
I'm determined on running, but I think it's important that I allay fears by let them see me out there. Let me see them out. For the longest time it was, Biden's not prepared to sit with us unscripted. Biden's not prepared to, anyway.
Now, we have two smart minds who we rely on a lot, and I know you trust, to talk through where in the world we are today. What is it, 19, James? We got 19 lawmakers, I think, Democrats in the House, plus, of course, we have one senator we told you about yesterday. That's not dozens. And there are a lot of questions about what the heck. We've got another week now. Milwaukee starts on Monday, the Republican National Committee. So it sure feels like Joe Biden's got another week to work on this. Jim Kessler is here, the Democratic strategist, of course, from Third Way, and Lisa Camuso-Miller, former RNC communications director and host of the Friday Reporter podcast. Guys, it's great to have you both here. I really appreciate your being with us this day after the debate. Lisa, what's going through your mind? You've been with us a couple of stages here over the course of this 2-week period since the debate. Did anything change last night?
No, Joe, I really don't think anything did change. In fact, if anything, I think that what we saw over the course of the last week is some real restraint on the side of the Democrats. NATO was in Washington, D.C. Any step away from Joe Biden, any erosion of confidence in him during that summit would really have been irresponsible. And to me, it feels like now we turn our sights back to how it is the Congress is going to respond to what happened. It was a neutral conference for me last night, the press conference. He didn't win any accolades. He didn't lose any accolades. He demonstrated some understanding of foreign policy, but that really is sort of his bailiwick and what he's known well for a long time. But there were a lot of stumbles, and unfortunately, we can't unsee what we saw the night of the debate. And that, to me, is what really indicates that perhaps this will continue to erode over the course of time. It's not going in the right direction for President Biden. And to that point, I think that there will be a continued loss of support among amongst the electeds.
So that sounds like nothing changed to me. Jim, we haven't spoken since the debate. And our listeners know you, I think, associate you with Chuck Schumer based on your years working with the majority leader in the Senate. But you're also close to Nancy Pelosi, and you talk to a lot of the people who are reportedly having backroom conversations about this. What's really going on?
Yeah, so I think with the leaders of the House and the Senate, and I'd add Hakeem Jeffries to that as well, that there's a lot of listening going on for the members of Congress. And, you know, there are some members of Congress who've come out publicly, either strongly supporting Joe Biden or saying, you know, it's time to step aside. Most members haven't said really anything definitive publicly. They're keeping those remarks private. Those remarks are going to the respective leaders of the caucus. I know today it was reported that Hakeem Jeffries had a private meeting with President Biden last night. That was to basically tell him what he was hearing from the caucus. I know there's a lot of nervous Democrats there. On the question is, will Joe Biden be the nominee for the Democrats going into November? I don't think we know the answer at this point. Certainly that is Joe Biden's desire right now. I thought his performance yesterday was very, very good, actually. But, you know, there are still not doubts whether he can do the job, but doubts whether he convince Americans that he can do the job.
Right. Well, look, I think we all think of you as a pretty straight shooter here, Jim. Is limbo then a good way to describe where we're at?
Yeah, and look, there are leading indicators and there are lagging indicators on these sort of things. And elected officials a lot of times are a lagging indicator. Like they're waiting because there isn't a ton of benefit from going out there first. Donors are often a leading indicator. Look, I think Joe Biden in the last 15 days, he is surviving that debate, but that doesn't mean that he has completely survived it. Like there's still questions about whether, you know, the Democratic Party really wants him to continue or not.
Lisa, we've got new numbers out today. NPR, PBS NewsHour, Marist, and they're tied again. This is the second poll we've seen this week with these two tied. In this case, Biden leading Trump 50 to 48% in a head-to-head. So, you know, statistically tied here. But pretty interesting when you drop a third party and Donald Trump actually gets a bit of an advantage. I just wonder, you know, if we're getting ahead of ourselves here, because I've got the second poll here this week telling me that we're tied. This was taken after the debate. And you know what? Joe Biden gained a point since last month's survey. Do you believe these polls?
I have a very hard time with polls these days, Joe, and it's because so many questions go into who it is that's participating in the polls. Are they voters that are actually going to turn out? Are they honestly telling us what they want from their elected officials? And so to me, what I take away from those numbers is exactly what we've known all along, is that the electorate is unhappy with both of these choices. And it remains the same. Nothing has changed. We have one candidate that has been indicted. We have another candidate who is at a super advanced age. And both of those candidates are unpalatable to the American people. And so people are really finding themselves in a place where they're not really excited about one or the other. And that, to me, is what I take away from that survey research that you're sharing today.
Connection. I want to go back to this news conference last night because we had a couple of flubs. Jim, I know you have characterized this as a good, if not great, performance for Joe Biden. But we know that earlier he was introducing President Zelensky. He called him President Putin. And yes, he did correct himself immediately. We should be fair about that. Then this happened during the news conference. Remember this?
What concerns do you have about Vice President Harris's ability to beat Donald Trump if she were at the top of the ticket?
Look, I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president.
Okay, he meant Kamala Harris. I'm trying to be fair here, Jim, because I screw up my words all the time when I'm on the air. Is this another brick in the wall? Is this just Joe Biden? How do you read these moments?
Well, I'm perfect with my diction at all times.
I know you are. I know.
Look, So here's the thing. He did an hour-long live press conference on some pretty complicated topics, and the Wall Street Journal, who is not super favorable to Joe Biden, said like he showed his encyclopedic knowledge of foreign affairs. But there's going to be flubs, some because he's Joe Biden, and some because of his age. Okay. And I think if he didn't have the bad debate performance that we saw, we'd be kind of shrugging that off. But I think it goes back to this question. The NATO summit showed he can do this job. But the coverage of that flub shows that communicating to the American people whether he can do that job has become a higher bar to clear for him since the debate than before the debate. And look, his ultimate job now is winning. So that's the question that Biden is wrestling with and Democrats are wrestling with.
Put this in perspective for me, Lisa. You were a creature of the House for some time. You worked for a former Republican speaker. We heard from Jim Himes, and this is an important Democrat in the House, like I said, within moments of the news conference ending, as well. Scott Peters of California, Eric Sorensen of Illinois. What we don't have are dozens that even Bloomberg reported at one point. We were hearing from sources that there was going to be a letter with dozens of names on it. Then we heard Nancy Pelosi told everybody to wait until after NATO, have respect, wait for the world leaders to leave. We still have not seen a letter like that. So should Joe Biden be upset that we're at 19 now or whatever it is, or relieved that we're not in the dozens of lawmakers calling for him to step down?
Oh, I think that if you're the president and if you're someone who has operated in these hallways and these conference rooms as long as President Biden has, he knows that there is only a short amount of time in order to win people back. And so he's doing everything he can to demonstrate capability and qualifications and ask people to step aside from that distraction and move forward towards the ultimate goal, which is his goal is to defeat President Trump. But I think, too, we're also, to your point about NATO being in town, to your point about next week being the Republican National Convention, I think that there is a series of things that are all happening at the same time that smart strategists on the Democrat side are taking a look to see what makes sense. And perhaps this is a longer road for the president. Perhaps there is a couple of weeks of grace where he can get people back to being with him on the possibility of staying in the race. I watched Congressman Himes last night as he talked about the fact that he called for the president to step aside, and his ultimate item and top reason for asking the president to step aside is because of his worry over whether or not this president now today, Joe Biden, the Joe Biden we have seen in the debate and last night in the press conference, is capable of beating Donald Trump. And that was his biggest piece. It's not about whether or not he's in favor of Joe Biden. He is concerned that whoever it is that runs on the Democratic ticket must take down Donald Trump because he sees that as the ultimate threat.
A couple of weeks of grace, Lisa. I think that's a really interesting way of putting it. And it sounds to me that both of you are in some ways saying the same thing. But Jim, is it a couple weeks of grace, or is it what I read this morning in the playbook from one Democratic aide? This is the worst of all worlds after last night. Damaging for Biden's prospects, but not so bad it provides enough fodder to use this to dump him from the ticket. It's pretty cold stuff, Jim, but does it ring true?
Well, there's a point where we're going to need real clarity and moving forward in which everyone is saying, okay, this is our task now. We're going ahead. And, we're not at that point now. I think Biden is in a better place than he was several days ago, but he's in a worse place than he was 15 days ago. Okay. Yeah. And look, he needs to do more. If he was going to convince both the insiders and the electorate that he's the guy to beat Donald Trump, he needs to do a lot more of the, unscripted press conferences and calling into local and national television stations and radio stations and unscripted town halls. And flubs be damned. There's always going to be some gaps, but he's got to show that because he needs to convince people not that he can do the job, but he needs to convince voters that, he's up to it. Washington knows.
Well, he's on his way to Detroit today to make the case. Jim Kessler, it's great to have you back. And Lisa Camuso Miller, this is.
It's 12:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long at Bloomberg. We are looking at gains for the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, and yes, the Russell 2000. Stocks ending the week on a positive note as the latest economic data reinforces bets that the Fed will be cutting rates in September. A major rally underway with about 85% of the S&P 500 index higher as the index reclaims the 5,600 mark. Right now we got the S&P at 5625, up 0.7%. The Dow, by the way, at a record 40,070, up 317 right now, up 0.8%. NASDAQ up 147, up by 0.8%. 10-year yield 4.19% with the 2-year right now at 4.47%. Spot gold lower by $1, little change, 24.14 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude flat on the day now, 82.60 a barrel. Boeing has notified some 737 MAX customers in recent weeks that aircraft due for delivery in 2020 2025 and 2026 face additional delays. Boeing shares down now by 1.6%. Rival Airbus shares, they're higher by 1.2%. Big banks after earnings lower. Citigroup down 1.5%. JP Morgan Chase down 0.2%. And also shares of Wells Fargo, they are plunging now by just about 6%. StubHub going to be delaying its IPO launch until at least September, that according to the Wall Street Journal. I'm Charlie Pellet. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington, and once again your host. Here he is, Joe Matthew.
Charlie Pellet, we thank you. Happy Friday, Charlie. We'll be back on the markets a little bit later this hour as Charlie Pellet keeps his eyes on Wall Street for us every day here on the fastest show in politics. You made it to the threshold of the weekend. Feels kind of like last Friday, with ongoing questions about Joe Biden's political future, but we did check the box on NATO. The news conference last evening brought the summit to an end following 3 days here in Washington in which nobody could drive anywhere. And a couple of things were accomplished, so we hear. But I want to go back to the beginning of this summit because it was here on this program on Monday before everybody came to town and we got rolling on this that we spent time with Andreas Kluth, who writes for Bloomberg Opinion. His headline that day was, Biden needs to go for NATO's sake too. Now that we've gone through the exercise, the bilats are done, the news conference happened, and world leaders are back on their jets to go home, we wanted to pull Andreas back to compare notes on some substance and some politics, and he's with us right now. Andreas Kluth, great to see you, sir. Happy Friday to you. Do you feel the same way? Would you write the same column today that you had Monday?
Absolutely, Joe. I'm glad about the timing, that column and the other one this week about Ukraine. But on the point of Biden, which I think is interesting to you, enough has been said about him, saying Putin instead of Zelensky, Trump instead of Harris, all of that. But having been at the conference, and I had a perspective that you may not have, which is you also get to listen to all the other leaders, not just of the other 31 NATO allies, but of the visiting Asian Pacific partners, not allies. And, they gave press conferences too and did panels and Q&A and in English and in their own language. And the contrast was just, I'll just give a shout out to Kaja Kallas of Estonia, Mette Frederiksen of Denmark. They were on the stage there discussing in beautiful English, sharp, witty, charming, quick, crystal clear and strong. I mean, that's what Putin needs to hear. So you're like, wow, this is a strong alliance. Then you come away and then you get the leader of the free world. And you're grateful when he makes it to the end of a sentence. And when he just spells out and keeps and holds a thought. And that is kind of depressing. And so that was one way or another what every conversation went back to.
That's remarkable. And that's firsthand. Andreas was 2 blocks over at the convention center all week with, to his point, not only NATO allies, but the 40 partners who joined us. We spent time this morning with Jens Stoltenberg, of course, the Secretary General, NATO, outgoing. Anne-Marie Hordern, my colleague, asked him about Joe Biden and his role in the alliance. Here's what he said.
The United States will remain a strong NATO ally because this also makes the United States safer and stronger. The United States is big, 25% of the world's GDP, but together with NATO allies, we are 50% of the world's GDP.
He went on to say, I worked with him when he was president last time. And again, I expect the United States will remain a strong NATO ally. When asked about Donald Trump, Andreas, how much was Donald Trump in the air at this summit, even as everyone had an eye on Joe Biden?
He was in the air all the time. The weird thing is nowadays, people are in one place together, but they're also simultaneously on their phones. And on their phones, they're following Trump, who was doing his campaign things, and also talked about NATO. At one point he said, well, I only just found out about it recently and stuff. And that was, of course, the other shock, because, Biden, one way or another, seems to be on the way out, but Trump seems to be on the way in. Mm-hmm. And Trump doesn't understand that point. Stoltenberg was speaking to many audiences, but also that audience of one, that being Trump. Trump doesn't seem to understand that the way Article 5, the mutual defense guarantee, it works to deter a war. So, and therefore is cheaper in the long run and even in the short run for the U.S. Trump doesn't seem to get that. And so people were constantly checking on Twitter and other things what Trump was saying at that moment. And it was, you know, it was eerie. It was awkward and it was eerie. And that hung over the whole conference, the whole summit, even though they were taking care of all these other big things as well, that in a normal summit would have been enough.
Think of the words you've used to describe this since we started talking. Awkward, eerie, and depressing. Is that what this week was?
Yes. I mean, it was also exciting and interesting and all those other things. But if you step back and yes, I'm sorry, but yes, it is slightly depressing, the whole thing. Because this is
that brings us to your headline
of 75 years of success, and you realize it might be the peak, and it might be downward from here. It is possible.
Wow. Well, I guess, you know, you're informing your own headline. As I've been looking at these, this was from 2 days ago, a great column by Andreas Kluth. NATO's bridge to Ukraine is a ramp to nowhere. Joe Biden and his NATO allies are right. They need to do more to back Kyiv. Andreas says promising membership where none is possible is the wrong way to go. Is that because Donald Trump's going to be sitting in the White House, or because we have to wait for this war with Russia to end?
It's because of those two reasons and others. But, you know, this is, I also called it the original sin of NATO, the 2008 summit, which was in Bucharest. George W. Bush wanted to admit Ukraine and Georgia. And Angela Merkel and other leaders said no. And so they had a compromise and they said Ukraine and Georgia will become members, but they didn't say a timeline. That basically got Putin into his tyrant mode, dictator mode, imperialist mode, and then made him launch the annexation of Crimea 2014 and eventually the full-scale invasion. So by having a bridge is on not one bank of the river, not the other, and you can fall off it and the enemy will bomb it while you're crossing it or building it. That is the problem. So we're leaving Ukraine in this limbo. We're therefore also giving Putin the narrative retroactively, the propaganda narrative that he constructed, which is that this is actually his war against Ukraine is also a war against the whole West. Somehow that has now become true, and yet we cannot extend Article 5 to Ukraine while it is fighting. We don't even know which part of its territory we would defend. So we're neither here nor there. And Biden should have separated two things. He should have armed and supported Ukraine much more, much earlier, much faster, without restrictions. I'm for that. But they should simply have said, but we cannot at the moment admit a new member under these circumstances. That separates these things. By having this bridge since 2008, they did it again in Vilnius last year and now here, that leaves Ukraine in a limbo. It gives Putin a propaganda victory and could even weaken or undermine the credibility of the 32 and their Article 5, because we seem to be giving them some sort of guarantee without enforcing it. And so that shouldn't have happened, but they did it again.
Fascinating. In our minute left, Andreas, it's been no, maybe, then yes for almost every request that Ukraine has made, whether it's Abrams tanks or F-16s or ATACMS. And there's a big question about whether Ukraine should be allowed to use U.S. and in some cases European or UK-provided weapons offensively against Russia. We gave them a couple of carve-outs on this. Is there going to be an eventual yes where it's open season using American weapons against Russia?
Yes, there will be a yes. And unfortunately, this is the pattern I just described. It's a gradual sort of maybe yes, yeah. Eventually it's yes. And, you know, one person who was making that case repeatedly and very lucidly, according to international law, was Jens Stoltenberg. He kept spelling out how in international law, of course, you're super allowed to fire back in the enemy's territory if they're firing at you.
Zelensky gave a very moving, like in broken English, but moving, clear response. They're bombing our children. This was after they bombed the children's hospital. Of course, we want to shoot back at the base from which the missile came. So let them.
Really glad you could join us, Andreas Kluth, on the 75th anniversary of NATO with questions about whether it is the peak of the alliance, according to Andreas Kluth. Find his writings on the terminal and online. Bloomberg Opinion, OPIN Go. Happy Friday. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. We'll assemble our panel next. Hope they got some rest. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano on the way in. After we check world and national news, for that we turn to Nancy Abrams in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom here in Washington. Nancy Lyons, I know your name, and it's great to see you. What do you have?
That's okay. President Biden will be campaigning in Michigan today following last night's hour-long news conference. He's hoping that performance will put questions about his candidacy to rest. He did deliver a few gaffes, but also demonstrated a deep understanding of foreign affairs. He also showed no signs of backing down from his pledge to stay in the race. Larry Sabato is director of the Center for Politics at the University of Virginia.
I think the odds are pretty good that as long as he continues to stay in the race and wants to be the Democratic nominee, he is going to be the Democratic nominee.
Larry Sabato says most supporters are likely grateful Biden made it through tough questioning in front of the large crowd. AT&T believes a hacker has stolen records of calls and texts from almost all of its wireless customers. The company says the stolen data does not include the content of calls or text or personal info like social security numbers or birth dates. It does, however, include which numbers a customer interacted with and data like how long the call lasted. One person has already been arrested. About 500,000 Houston residents have been told they'll be without power until next week following Hurricane Beryl. Tony Cisneros is a CenterPoint Energy customer.
We look around the neighborhood. There's no utility trucks in the neighborhood, so not getting the warm fuzzies from listening to or reading these texts saying, oh, yeah, we're on it.
Texas Governor Greg Abbott has vowed to investigate the storm response. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We've got the Dow Jones Industrial Average at a record above 40,000 once again. 40,042, up 288 points right now, up by about 0.7%. Off-session highs, but still up by almost 290 points on the Dow. The S&P up 42, up by about 0.8%. Did see a record a few minutes ago, but right now 56.27 is where we stand. NASDAQ up 161, up by 0.9%. Perhaps the big story is the continuing rally for small cap shares, with the Russell 2000 up another 1% today. That's on top of yesterday's 3.6% surge. 10-year 4.19%, the 2-year 4.47%. Spot gold today is flat on the day, $24.15 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude oil up 0.2% right now, $82.82 a barrel. Stocks ending the week on a positive note as the latest economic data reinforces bets that the Fed will be cutting rates in September. However, there is a sinking feeling in today's report on consumer sentiment from the University of Michigan. And with that story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
The Consumer Sentiment Index dropped to an 8-month low in early July. Blame it for the most part on inflation. Financial confidence is the lowest since October, and the spending outlook for big-ticket durable goods is the lowest in just over a year. The report also notes angst over November's election may be weighing on the outlook on Main Street. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
Boeing shares lower by 1.3% after notifying some 737 MAX customers in recent weeks that aircraft due for delivery in 2025 and 2026 face additional delays. It's another reminder the production of its cash cow jetliner faces a long road to recovery. Rival Airbus, the ADRs there, up 1.2%. Bank earnings. The big banks that reported this morning are all trading lower. Wells Fargo down 5.9%. JP Morgan Chase after earnings down 0.4%. Citigroup after earnings down 1.8%. Recapping, stocks are pushing higher. A Friday rally underway. S&P up 43, up 0.8%. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington, and once again your host, here he is, Joe Matthew.
Thank you, Charlie. Welcome to the Friday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg Radio. We add YouTube, of course, on all of our broadcasts. You can find us on YouTube by searching Bloomberg Global News. And, of course, SiriusXM makes it easy to find Bloomberg Radio anywhere you are. We'll add our global TV audience to the program coming up in our second hour with a very similar conversation to the one here that we were having yesterday, which says to me that things could have gone better last night. But then again, we heard from so many minds yesterday that it didn't matter before it even started. To be a fly on the wall for the big meeting today, House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries meeting privately with Joe Biden. I guess it happened last night, in fact. In my conversation with President Biden, Jeffries says, Democratic leader in the House, I directly expressed the full breadth of insight, heartfelt perspectives, and conclusions about the path forward that the caucus has shared in our recent time together. This from a letter from Jeffries. As we add a couple of more names, but no dam breaking here. Representative Jim Hines, Representative Scott Peters, Representative Eric Sorensen, all Democrats, Connecticut, California, Illinois, respectively, sending out statements after the news conference that Joe Biden ought to leave the race. But there's no critical mass. Hakeem Jeffries is still listening. And I wonder how our panel feels 12 and change hours after this ended. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributors, were with us as part of our special coverage last night. And once again, Jeannie, we have pretty simple questions. How are you feeling after sleeping on it?
It feels like the Democrats are in a bit of purgatory here. For those who want him to step aside, not because they don't like Joe Biden or, appreciate what he's done, but because they think he doesn't have a path forward, there's not much that has changed. In fact, as we look, the polls have come out today. Marist, for instance, Joe Biden can go to them and say, look, I am still tied. So for those people, not much changed. And then, of course, for the people who support Joe Biden, his staff and others who think he did a very good job last night, and he had some very good moments last night, they are more inclined to say, this is where we need to be. We are ready to proceed ahead. So Democrats still in the same bind they were in. And I expect that this is going to continue as he heads to Michigan, as he talks to the NAACP next week, as he talks to Lester Holt. Not much is going to change. So he's, being confronted on the one hand by his own party, half of which seem to want him out. And of course, real vicious attacks by Republicans, including Donald Trump, who are looking at his every gaffe and pointing them out on social media.
Rick, I don't know if you're feeling exhausted like a lot of people are with this conversation, but Lisa Camuso-Miller earlier this hour referred to a couple of weeks of grace, that's what this would add up to with an inevitable end for Joe Biden. This day after, is that how you feel?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd characterize it as grace, because that's the assumption that he's kind of like out there to do his own thing. There is a massive effort behind the scenes going on with Democratic operatives, strategists, and members to get him out of this race. And it's a survival mode, right? A lot of these members in the House, they see their elections being imperiled by the top of the ticket. And, it's not about Joe Biden at this point. It's about, political survival. And so there's going to be very tumultuous waters in the Democratic Party for some time. So he's going to have, I would say, not what I would call a grace period, but he's going to have a period where, his ship, his campaign ship is going to be tossed around in very turbulent waters in the Democratic Party, trying, frankly, to get it to sink. And that's a tough place to be. We won't notice it that much because we'll be paying attention to the Republican convention this week. But that's what's happening today. It's been happening for the last 2 weeks, and it's what's going to happen for the next 2 weeks, until at which point in time, either that boat runs ashore and Joe Biden becomes the nominee in August in Chicago, or he doesn't. And then it's like all kinds of different issues that can come up.
Rick Davis, the king of metaphors. What does Kamala do here? This isn't awkward at all, right, Jeannie? I mean, do they try to get her out in case this is really happening? Do they keep her quiet in case this is happening? What's the strategy for her?
For Kamala Harris, I think she's going to continue to be publicly supportive of Joe Biden. We heard so many questions last night about Kamala Harris from the start of the press conference, and the reporting that the campaign has denied that they are testing to see how she matches up to Donald Trump. But of course, one of the most important questions asked last night was, if the numbers showed, if we could prove to you, if your campaign could prove to you, Joe Biden, that she has a better shot of beating Donald Trump, would you step aside? And he was not willing to say he would. And then he kind of morphed into, the numbers won't show that. So for Kamala Harris, what an uncomfortable position to be in. But I think publicly she will maintain the course of, very supportive of the president and denying any, claim that there is a movement afoot to see how she would stack up against Donald Trump. So, not a position you want to be in if you're Harris, but she's got to just sit this one out, theoretically.
Interesting numbers from NPR, PBS NewsHour. Marist said to be Biden-friendly. Rick, I don't know how much stock you put in this poll here, but it's another reading where they're statistically tied. We talked about another one just yesterday. In this case, Biden 50, Trump 48 in a head-to-head. Biden's actually up a point since last month before the debate. He's up a point since the debate. Should we be trusting these numbers? Or are you giving national polls time right now?
No, I would never give national polls time in a presidential election, because it's not a national election. It doesn't matter who gets the popular vote. We've learned that, all right? I mean, it's not actually a benefit with a difference. You look at Arizona, Trump up by 5. You look at Nevada, Trump up by 5. You look at Wisconsin, Trump up by 3. I mean, come on. I mean, Trump is winning again in every single battleground state, and in most of them beyond the margin of error. And that has gone up since the Biden debate. And and for Trump. And it was going down the week after his indictments. So this campaign has changed. And there's actually a good article on Terminal. Ian Marlowe wrote about Biden now has a two-front war. This is how campaigns are waged, right? He had a one-front war. He had to beat Donald Trump. And all of a sudden, behind him, unprotected, unfinanced, undefended, is the entire Democratic Party trying to find an alternative to him. And that means he takes his eye off of Donald Trump. A disaster. If Harris had one thing to do, she would go into overdrive to go after Donald Trump, because regardless of what happens to Joe Biden, she cares about beating Donald Trump. And whether she's the vice presidential nominee, the presidential nominee, or a rooter for the Democratic cause, she has to be the tip of the spear now going after Donald Trump, because right now Joe Biden's got 50% of his time looking over his shoulder.
Boy, okay, so they're putting the wrong candidate out on the road next week. Then Jeannie, in that world, right? He's going into Detroit today. He's got the interview with Lester Holt on Monday. They're doing Nevada. They're doing Texas, all over the course of the next week here. This is a waste of time?
I don't think so. Joe Biden needs to be out as much as possible, meeting with voters and making his case, as Rick mentioned, to Democrats and against Donald Trump. And of course, you can do two things at once. You know, Kamala Harris has been out a good deal, and she will continue to be out there waging a war against the Republicans, talking about issues like choice. The problem is, of course, that this issue of Joe Biden's competence has really taken all the oxygen out of the room, and all the other things that Democrats want to talk about have fallen by the wayside. One good thing about the upcoming RNC for Democrats is that it may switch some of the media focus from Biden to Trump, to his VP nominee, to the Republican Party, and that may give the Democrats a bit of breathing room, maybe, in order to get this together. You know, and I think as we go back to the polls, one thing to notice with all of these polls, whether it's the Marist poll today, whether it's the Ipsos poll yesterday, showing that the race has not changed that much nationally. I know Rick Davis doesn't like the national polls as much, but nationally, I think just speaks to the fact that voters have been way ahead of the elites on this question of Joe Biden's competence and age. This was figured in. The debate, as much as it brought it to the forefront for the media, for those of us who watch this on a daily basis, for voters, they had already noted and they had already put this into context. So the debate from that perspective didn't change the polls nationally all that much.
You know what else is in your favorite poll here, Rick? No other mainstream Democrat who has been mentioned as a possible replacement for Joe Biden does better than Joe Biden. And this is the stuff he's looking at, right? This is why he's convinced that he can beat Donald Trump. How would you answer that if you were advising him?
Look, I mean, it's a false precision, right? I mean, like, you never know who's going to do well until you actually have them in the race, and voters look at that as the two options they have. Right now, voters know the two options they have are Trump, Biden, and then it's a fair judgment to say, and in a five-way race, adding all the third-party candidates, where are you? It is not a fair option to get an accurate poll and say, oh, and by the way, if there's this scenario and it's not, Biden and it's Harris or Whitmer or any one of these other Democrats, then it's not fair. When you look at the fave-unfave, Harris's fave-unfave mirrors Donald Trump and is 10 points higher. Both of them have a 10-point higher fave-unfave than Joe Biden. That means that there are 10% more voters willing to look at those candidacies than at Joe Biden's candidacy. That is a fair, comparison. And so it's just not accurate to say that Joe Biden is in a better position or the same position as any of these other candidates. Whitmer has a 70% approval rating in Michigan. What is Joe Biden's approval rating in Michigan? It's in the low 40s. Who would you rather have on the ticket to win Michigan, which you have to win if you're a Democrat? So I could go on and on, but the bottom line is it's all false precision. Joe Biden won't get out of this race because someone tells him that the polls are bad. He'll get out of this race if he believes that he doesn't have the physical capacity to stand up to Donald Trump and wage a campaign that needs to be waged between now and November. And that's the real debate.
Our signature panel will come back in hour 2. Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis with some important thoughts today as we try to figure out the next stage in this story. Kaylee Lyons is on the way in too, and I hope you'll stay with us as we welcome our global TV audience to the fastest show in politics. This is Bloomberg.
politics to the world of business. This is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
Joe Biden wraps the NATO summit in political limbo. Welcome to the fastest show in politics. As Democrats argue today over the president's performance, whether he should stay in this race, as world leaders leave Washington now and we prepare for the start of the Republican National Convention. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington this day after the big news conference. Kaylee, We've got new polling out as well. Another national poll granted, and one that tends to be favorable to Joe Biden, showing this remaining a tied race.
Yeah, effectively. NPR, PBS, and Marist putting out fresh data, again, a national poll that shows Biden actually leading Trump 50% to 48%. That's in a head-to-head contest, though. And the thing is, when you add third parties in, it's Trump who's ahead by a single point. So the moral of the story is this is still an incredibly close race. And if Joe Biden is to be believed, it is a race that he is staying in, despite more defections from within the Democratic Party.
Yeah, Republican analyst Lisa Camuso-Miller with us earlier on Bloomberg referred to a couple of weeks of grace that it appears his party might be giving him as we feel this out. We know Hakeem Jeffries, the House Democratic leader, met with Joe Biden and issued a letter saying that they had an honest talk as he continues to listen to his rank and file. What did we get? 3 more defections after the news conference last night?
Indeed, and one more this morning. Brittany Peterson of Colorado making it 18 congressional Democrats who have now called for Biden to step aside. We'll talk later this hour with one Democrat who is not. Congressman John Garamendi of California will be with us. We'll also be joined by the Foreign Minister of Poland, Radek Sikorski, keeping in mind that Joe Biden, when he gave that press conference last night, well, very much addressing a domestic audience, was wrapping up the NATO summit that took
That's
place.
for sure. We have a lot to talk about when it comes to the takeaways for Ukraine and, frankly, Kayleigh, the future of this alliance, whether Donald Trump will be in the White House and whether European political changes will impact that. Andreas Kluth, the Bloomberg Opinion, referred to this potentially as the peak moment for the alliance this week.
Wow, and what a moment we are marking. Let's get a check on the moments happening in financial markets today. Charlie Pellet has a look with up-to-date trading in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Oh, well, hello there, Kayleigh. Good day to you both. Indeed, we are looking at records right now, not only on the S&P 500 index, also on the Dow Jones Industrial Average, NASDAQ pushing higher, and so is the Russell 2000, building on yesterday's surge, up another 1.2% on the Russell 2000. Right to the numbers, we've got the S&P at a record 56.35, up 50, up by 0.9%. The Dow also at a record right now, 40,105, up 352, up 0.9%. Just about the best level of the day. NASDAQ up 187, higher now by 1%. 10-year 4.19%, the 2-year 4.47%. Gold lower little change, down 75 cents the ounce to 24.14, while West Texas Intermediate crude 82.81 a barrel, up now by 0.2%, higher now by 20 cents on WTI. Again, West Texas Intermediate crude 82.82 a barrel. Stocks ending the week on a positive note as the latest economic data reinforces bets that the Fed will be cutting rates in September. Unilever cutting a third of its office staff in Europe as the consumer goods giant pushes ahead with plans to slash 7,500 jobs worldwide. Unilever shares are up now by 1.9%. Bank earnings front and center today. Wells Fargo dropping 5.6% after earnings. JP Morgan Chase down 0.6% after earnings, and Citigroup shares lower now by 1.9%. So again, recapping here, records, perhaps the key takeaway right now with the S&P up 49, up 0.9%, a broad-based advance with the Russell 2000 index up now by 24 points. The Russell 2000 up by just about 1.1%. Balance of power continues now. Lots going on. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kayleigh Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet with a look at the Friday trade. Thank you so much. Meanwhile, here in Washington on this Friday, it's the day after for President Biden, who seems to be stuck in some kind of political limbo after his news conference last night that by and large focused on foreign policy. He spoke at length about many topics, fielded questions about his age, and almost got through it without gaffing, but not entirely, as this happened in the very first answer he gave at the press conference.
What concerns do you have about Vice President Harris's ability to beat Donald Trump if she were at the top of the ticket?
Look, I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president.
He did have an earlier stumble in which he was introducing President Zelensky. He called him President Trump, quickly corrected himself. Sorry, Putin. Thank you.
We all do it.
See? I keep saying that. And that's part of the story here. And you wonder if these little gaffes that I can get away with on the air like I just did, and Joe Biden has for 40 years, are still part of the problem that we're talking about now when it comes to stamina, signs of aging. None of that is new for Joe Biden.
No.
And people who know him are kind of used to that. So when we try to delineate between what matters here and what doesn't, we look to the likes of Gregory Cordy, Bloomberg politics reporter, who's been knee-deep in all this stuff, including our own polling here. And Gregory, I just wonder, having had a chance to sleep on this, what your view is if Joe Biden's in the same place he was before he walked on stage last night.
Yeah, having slept on it, I kind of think that we're in the same place as we were last night, that he didn't necessarily win over any of the critics from within his own party who have asked him to step aside. But he didn't really do much additional damage either. There were 3 or 4 members of Congress who, after his press conference, did put in their calls and joined the chorus of Democrats asking him to step aside. But you kind of got the impression that those were prepared statements. They were just waiting on the press conference to put those out, and their minds had already been made up. So again, we just kind of have to watch in the coming days to see whether that drumbeat continues. It has been a steady drip, drip, drip over the past couple of weeks. But each time this question comes up to Joe Biden, he is steadfast. He is not getting out of this race. He does not believe that there's anybody who could do any better than him. He does not believe that he's going to lose to Donald Trump at this point. And the polling, as it continues to come in, I think we've seen a little bit of a floor. We've reached a point where the Biden trails probably by no more than 3 percentage points in the national polls, a little bit worse in some of the swing state polls. And so if the bleeding stops, maybe there's only upside as Biden world sees it. But again, we're going to have to wait for more data and more voices to weigh in.
Well, one voice did weigh in kind of today, Gregory, and that would be the House Democratic leader, Hakeem Jeffries, who put out a Dear Colleague letter saying that he met with President Biden yesterday. And to quote Leader Jeffries, in my conversation with Biden, I directly expressed the full breadth of insight, heartfelt perspectives, and conclusions about the path forward that the caucus has shared in our recent time together. What the leader did not say, Gregory, is I told Joe Biden I endorse his reelection run, that others within the caucus want him to stay in this race. How should we read between the lines here?
Yeah, what's really remarkable is that Democrats have given space to dissent within their own party, which is something that you don't see, by the way, on the Republican side. Remember, Donald Trump was indicted, went to trial, and was convicted on 34 felonies, and we heard nary a peep from anyone within the Republican Party that, maybe there should be some consideration that Trump should step aside for a new nominee. And so this is part of what makes the Democratic Party the Democratic Party. It's a little bit messier sometimes. And what I see in that Dear Colleague letter from Hakeem Jeffries is he's really representing the caucus here. He is trying to play the role of a sort of a good faith interlocutor between some of these critics and the White House, and to go to Biden and give him the full breadth of opinion from his caucus, all the way from he needs to get out right now to then I'm a little bit worried, I'd like to see a little bit more strength in the president, to, on the other hand, I'm all in all the way to November. And you see that range of opinions within the Democratic caucuses in Congress.
Gregory Cordy, thank you for joining us. Gregory reporting from Washington here this day after the news conference that, of course, ended the NATO summit. As we looked at Joe Biden at the podium last night, the big 75th anniversary emblem right in front of him. This is a big moment for the alliance. And there was more at play than just Joe Biden's acuity. And we're going to get into a lot of this now. As we heard from the president last evening, he spoke for roughly 1 hour, 59 minutes, and he was asked about what he was hearing about his age, about his status politically here from world leaders at NATO. Here he is.
I'm not had any of my European allies come up to me and say, Joe, don't run. What I hear them say is, you've got to win. You can't let this guy come forward. He'd be a disaster. It'd be a disaster. I mean, I think he said in one of his rallies, don't hold me to this, recently, where NATO, I just learned about NATO or something to that effect. Foreign policy has never been his strong point.
Joe Biden, of course, making those remarks as he wrapped up the three-day NATO summit here in Washington. And joining us now is someone who is in town for that summit. The foreign minister of Poland, Radek Sikorski, is here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. Minister, welcome back to Bloomberg. It's lovely to have you. I wonder what your perception of Joe Biden was, not just in the press conference last night, but over the course of your visit to Washington this week. Do you see a man not only capable of leading a country for another 4.5 years, but effectively leading the free world?
Look, I'm not interfering in your internal affairs. I can tell you that we had a summit with President Biden in March with our president, our prime minister. I was there. We had, I think, 90 minutes of conversation. President Biden was focused, strategic, and quite humorous, actually. Slip-ups happen. You know, I was just meeting with your journalist, and I made a slip-up, and I didn't correct myself. We need America to lead, and President Biden is leading the effort on Ukraine, for which we are very grateful.
I just used the wrong name on the air before you came in. I did a slip up, and I do it all the time. We're trying to figure out what counts as a slip and what qualifies as deterioration. And I would ask you, you're not a doctor. We don't have to dwell on your view on that necessarily, but this is a very important moment for the alliance. We're talking about the potential for enormous change here domestically, politically, in the United States. There's a lot of noise around the president, as we already know, which could have been a bit of a distraction. But there's also great uncertainty about the trajectory of politics in a number of European nations, having seen elections in France, having seen a change in leadership in the UK. Some are calling this a peak for NATO, that it might not be the same following this moment. How does the alliance survive the uncertainty globally, politically now?
Well, let's unpick what you just said. There's change in the UK, but I am assured by the new government, and the foreign minister visited me at home in Poland on the third day of him holding office, that Ukraine will be solid. The Britain will be solid on Ukraine, and Prime Minister Starmer reaffirmed that. In France, some people worried that the nationalist side of the politics will take over. That hasn't happened. Putin is constantly counting on our divisions and on our inefficiency, and he doesn't understand our psychology, and he doesn't understand that we are in it for the long haul. Look, as you said, I took part in the summit yesterday. I was impressed at how consistent and powerful and persuasive almost all the leaders of the alliance were in saying we are in it for the long run until Ukraine is a secure, independent nation. And we have some good decisions out of this summit, and President Biden is the author of these good decisions.
Well, we don't know that he'll be President Biden beyond January for.
Well, that's democracy for you.
Certainly. And even the president of Poland, President Duda, has told Joe and I that if it does turn out to be a second Donald Trump administration, he can work with Donald Trump. We hear it frequently from other diplomats such as yourself, a willingness to work with whomever. I guess my question is, do you really believe that Donald Trump will be as willing to work with you as President Biden?
We keep in touch with the administration and with the alternative administration, as we do with any other democracy. We have a cohabitation in Poland. The president is from a more Trumpian side of Polish politics, and he's kept in touch with President Trump all along, and we encourage him. I personally, of course, work with the administration, but I talk to President Trump's people, and some of the things that they tell me about what they plan to do are interesting and creative.
Not frightening.
Politics is a difficult business. Some of these things are very controversial. We were disappointed that the American supplemental took so long, but eventually the good thing happened. We hope that President Trump will want to be a winner, and a winner of getting to a fair peace in Ukraine, which means Ukraine enjoying its liberty.
Do you worry about the idea of redefining Article 5, as Donald Trump has suggested, based on the level of financial contribution? Is that a creative idea?
Well, he was right to insist that allies should spend more. And I publicly defended him.
And many have.
Even in style, because when predecessors did it politely, it didn't work.
How about that?
Okay, so the combination of President Trump's and Joe Biden's pressure and the war in Ukraine resulted in the fact that 23 out of the 32 allies now spend 2% of GDP on defense. Poland spends 4%. And we are going to spend 5 next year. We are number 1 in NATO, including the United States, in proportion, obviously, because we are no longer in eternal post-Cold War peace. But to think about, so this is a good thing, and that was needed. But an alliance is not a neighborhood security company. Take Iceland, which is a NATO member, which hardly has a defense budget at all, but it has other vital assets. Its territory, its ability to refuel, to bring. When we rallied around the United States, when countries were spending under 2%, we sent first Poland, 1 brigade to Afghanistan, another brigade to Iraq. Others did the same. So the level of spending shouldn't be the only yardstick.
Just in our final moment with you, something else that came out of this summit was the labeling of China as a decisive enabler of Russia. And we also know that Donald Trump is quite hawkish toward China, as is Joe Biden for that matter. And I wonder if, to you, whatever the outcome of the election, does it seem that the U.S. is orienting more toward that adversary, leaving Europe to be the one who has to step up defense militarily against the threat of Russia?
Sequencing matters. If we enable Ukraine to win, to defend its independence and borders in the next couple of hours, then I think other theaters could become a priority. And actually helping Ukraine win, I believe, would also moderate China's behavior. China is respecting our thickest red line, which is not to send arms to Russia, unlike Iran or North Korea. And yes, China could actually bring their vassal Putin to heel and tell him to end this war. And we are making these representations to the Chinese leadership, and I hope they act on them.
We've enjoyed staying in touch with you, and I hope that you'll continue to factor us into your plans when you return to Washington. Thank you for joining us on this NATO Summit Week. The Foreign Minister of Poland, Radoslaw Sikorski, back with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons. With the summit in our rearview mirror, so too is the news conference that had so many people talking so much going into it. We now have the analysis coming out of it with Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. Our signature panel is up next. This is Bloomberg.
It's 121 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We've got a rally underway on Wall Street. S&P 500 index trading at a record, could see the 38th record of the year at the close for the S&P 500 index. The Dow also at a record. The Dow right now at 40,148, up 393 points. That is a gain of 1%. The S&P also up 1%, while the Nasdaq Composite Index up now by 201 points, up 1.1%. The Russell 2000 index of small cap shares building on yesterday's gains, with the Russell 2000 now up by 1.2%. 10-year yield at 4.19%, with a 2-year that's yielding 4.46%. Spot gold little changed at $24.15 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude is down 0.1%, 82.52 for a barrel of WTI. Bottom line here, stocks hitting fresh records after this morning's economic data reinforced bets that the Fed will be cutting rates in September. Amazon's artificial intelligence shopping assistant, Rufus, is now available to all U.S. customers following 5 months of testing with a subset of consumers. Amazon shares little changed on the day, up less than 0.1%. Big banks in the red after this morning's earnings report from Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, and Citigroup. Citigroup now down by 1.9%. JP Morgan Chase down 0.5. Hardest hit though, Wells Fargo down now by 5.6%. Recapping stocks higher, S&P up by 1%. The Russell 2000 up another 1.2% with a 10-year 4.19%. Balance of power continues now. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet in New York, thank you so much. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew here in Washington, where for weeks, over 2 weeks to be exact, the conversation that has dominated all of political thought is whether or not Joe Biden is sticking it out and will become, next month, the Democratic nominee in this election cycle, as a growing number of Democrats have called for him to step aside. Now, 18 congressional Democrats, as of the last count, have done so. And the question is not just, can Joe Biden stop the bleeding, but has there been too much bleeding already? This is something we spoke with Charlie Cook of the famed Cook Political Report about last night, just ahead of Biden's presser.
I think the president's lost control of events here. And, you know, it's not really a question of whether, it's sort of when and how, and I think it's going to be pretty soon. It's just starting to tumble out of control, and I don't think there's any stopping it. I think, you know, it's just a matter of days or hours or something.
Sounding a lot like Rick Davis to me. As we assembled our panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, Bloomberg Politics contributors, it was, Kaylee, the night of the debate when Rick sat with us at this table and essentially said that. Now that we have Jeannie Shanzano back in the fold this week, she too agrees that Joe Biden will eventually need to step down in this case. And I'll point you both, welcome Rick and Jeannie, following a late night here on Bloomberg TV and radio. A Dear Colleague letter sent this morning by House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries. He met with the president, says he expressed the full breadth of insight, heartfelt perspectives, and conclusions about the path forward that the caucus has shared in our recent time together. Jeannie, how difficult was that meeting for Joe Biden?
It had to be terribly difficult on both sides. I mean, imagine being the minority leader and having to share the number of people Kaylee was just talking about. And I was hearing, you know, thinking back, Kaylee last night was saying a dozen, then it crept up to 15. Now it's at 18. It's not going in the right direction. And, you know, I think it's important to put the context here, like Charlie Cook was talking about. This is an issue of a path forward. And I am really struck by this piece by Democrat Doug Sosnick, who is talking about the fact that Joe Biden's path to the presidency for a re-election has all but vanished, and Trump is the clear winner. And you go through the numbers that he's laying out, and again, this is a Democrat, and he says he's never seen such a grim electoral college landscape for Biden, and it gets worse from there. But the bottom line is, This predates the debate, which was horrifying enough. There's a reason that they wanted the debate in June, to stop the bleeding. And of course, as we all saw, it made it worse. And so he is in a position now when his path forward has become just one real path, and that is through the Rust Belt. That's why he's going to be in Michigan today. But it is a very narrow path for him, and opening up for Trump exactly opposite of what the Democrats want and need.
Well, in addition to his trip to Michigan, we understand, based on a number of outlets reporting, that Biden's going to be meeting with a number of key groups on the Hill today as well, or at least virtually: the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, the New Dems. It seems that he is still trying to do this outreach, Rick, but is it too far gone, considering that the majority of those 18 that we have talked about who have publicly called for him to step aside generally are white? They aren't these coalitions of color that we know were key to Joe Biden's victory in 2020.
Yeah, it's really phenomenal. Rearguard action 1 month from your convention. It's amazing that we find ourselves in this position with an incumbent president. All the advantages of incumbency has vanished for Joe Biden. If anything, it's a burden. And he's carrying that burden around, frankly, a burden he can't lift. So this is really phenomenal. I mean, you've got a guy who is struggling to prosecute a campaign against Donald Trump, and has struggled all year with that, and now has the additional burden of having to backfill his support amongst core constituency groups. These are people who should be voting for Joe Biden 95% of the time. And he's using scarce resources, his time, campaign efforts, to try and shore up his base a month before his party's convention. It's a phenomenally difficult position, one I have not seen in modern political history. This was, Ronald Reagan never had this problem, George Bush never had this problem, Bill Clinton never had this problem. I mean, there were people who had to firm up their base, but never to the degree where you spend a Friday afternoon after a NATO summit, basically begging, the various caucuses in Congress not to bolt on you. It's really shocking and historic. What we're seeing is the melting down of an entire party, to the degree that Joe Biden can take them down with him. And that's why people are coming out publicly and saying, please reconsider, get out of the race, because they see the drag on the party writ large, not just his campaign. And that is even more important, that if Donald Trump is president, the congressional Democratic Party needs to be healthy.
This is all happening, of course, Rick, as MAGA packs up from Milwaukee. We've got a convention that starts on Monday. I suspect we could get some news this weekend, potentially, on a vice presidential pick. This whole convention is beginning to take form. Reports suggest Donald Trump Jr. will have a primetime speaking slot to introduce the VP, whoever that may be. He's good friends with a senator from Ohio. I know that much. The mayor of East Palestine, Ohio, Trent Conway, is going to be speaking. So, too, apparently, well, at least attending, will be Melania Trump. It's unclear if she's going to actually have a speaking role. Dana White, another name that we're hearing about. Jeannie, Joe Biden's going to be sitting down with Lester Holt, NBC News, on Monday. He's got travel plans throughout the week. Does he stick with them?
I think he absolutely should. He should be out as much as possible. My view is he should have been out before and after the debate performance in that way. I don't know that it is going to stem the tide. I do think it is very interesting to hear that Donald Trump Jr. is going to be introducing the VP nominee, which leads me to conclude, although I have no basis for this, that it won't be Marco Rubio, because, of course, Donald Trump Jr. has said that would be a choice to give Republicans in the Senate incentive to impeach his father so that they could get Marco Rubio in the seat. I mean, just shocking thing to say. But you've got to imagine that if Donald Trump Jr. is doing this introduction, that Marco Rubio may not be amongst the top three that we've been hearing about. I don't know, but that's my conclusion, hearing he's making that introduction.
Of course, we just still don't know. We don't know when we will find out. We do know the convention starts Monday. What we also don't know, Rick, is whether or not this ticket Donald Trump and whoever is actually going to be up against a Biden-Harris ticket, or if something could realistically change. We touched on this a bit during our special coverage last night, Rick, but how unusual is that? If you're the Trump campaign, you're attaching someone else to your ticket and not knowing that this is actually the ticket that is going to do as well against whomever if Biden doesn't become the nominee.
Yeah, it's kind of like running against a ghost. You really don't know who's going to walk through that door, come their convention. So, yeah, you just got to package the best you can. Look, they've sliced and diced the electorate that's available to vote for Trump, right? I mean, these are very slim margins that will determine this election. So, certain kinds of suburban voters, certain kinds of, young male blacks, certain kinds of Hispanic voters, and they've matched up the various contestants against those voting groups that are most likely to go for Trump in a competitive election. They may leave something out because the ticket may change, but this is a pretty well-defined election, regardless of who's at the top of the ticket, on the Democratic side. So they can be very confident that they're putting together a package that they think is the best, ticket to go forward and try to appeal to these constituencies. So I don't think they worry about it a lot. Frankly, they're probably high-fiving each other right now as they roll into Milwaukee, because they've got a situation where today, as we've been talking about, Joe Biden is spending more time trying to shore up his base than attack Donald Trump. And that's a good day for Donald Trump. Every single day that occurs between now and Election Day, that is the standard. It's advantage Trump.
Advantage Trump with some counter programming from Joe Biden. It'll be interesting to see what takes place next week. It'll all unfold right here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Both Rick and Jeannie are going to be traveling with us this weekend for special coverage that will last through the week. We're going to be meeting you back here noontime Monday from Milwaukee. Kaylee Lyons, myself, our signature panel, and we'll have special coverage on the nominating speech Thursday evening when we actually see Donald Trump on the stage. Rick and Jeannie, safe travels. We'll see you a little bit later on the late edition of Balance of Power, and of course again in Milwaukee on Monday. We're going to be talking, by the way, with a Democratic member of the House coming up. Let's go to the source here, and in this case, a Biden supporter. John Garamendi of California will join us after we check world and national news. For that, we turn to Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington. Hi, Nancy.
Thanks, Joe. President Biden will be looking to shore up support in the battleground state of Michigan today. He is holding a campaign event there this evening. He showed his strength on foreign policy last night, but still made a couple of gaffes during the hour-long news conference. Senator Jim Clyburn appeared on NBC's Today Show and says Biden has his full support.
I am all in. I'm riding with Biden no matter what direction he goes, no matter what method he takes. I'm with Joe Biden. And if he were to change his mind, I'll just answer the question that I would be all in for the vice president.
Senator Clyburn again was on the Today Show. Republicans, like Senator John Cornyn, says going with Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket would be like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic.
The polling that I've seen indicates that she's about as unpopular as President Biden, so I don't think she's exactly a powerhouse alternative.
Cornyn says Harris has been the administration's point person on the southern border, which would likely doom her campaign. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Stocks continue to push higher. We're looking at records right now on the Dow, the S&P 500 index, and right now we have got NASDAQ advancing, no record, but right now higher by 237 points, up 1.3%. S&P, by the way, on track for its 38th record so far this year. NASDAQ 100 index up now by 1.3%. Perhaps the bigger story is the broadening of this market, with the Russell 2000 index continuing to advance, up now for a second day. That's on top of yesterday's 3.6% gain. Right now we have got the Russell 2000 index of small cap shares up by 1.3%. Bottom line, records for the Dow and a record for the S&P 500 index. The 10-year after this morning's PPI data, 4.18%. The 2-year, 4.46%. Gold up $1 the ounce to $24.16. Little change there. West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.3%, 82.36 a barrel on WTI. Novo Nordisk's Ozempic drug is being linked to lower rates of dementia and a range of other mental problems in a University of Oxford study that raises expectations about the diabetes drug's potential ancillary benefits. Novo Nordisk up today by 1.9%. Again, recapping, we got stocks higher. S&P up 62, now at 56.47, a gain of 1.1%. Balance of Power continues now back. We go to Washington once again. Your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
Okay, Charlie, thank you. Charlie Pellet helping us through the Friday session here on Balance of Power with our eyes on politics on Bloomberg TV and radio. Indeed, Kaylee Lyons with us from Washington as we read the Dear Colleague letter from Hakeem Jeffries, who met with Joe Biden last night. And pretty clear that this probably was not a very fun meeting, as he expressed in his words the full breadth of insight, heartfelt perspectives, and conclusions about the path forward that the caucus has shared in our recent time together. He did not call on Joe Biden to withdraw from the race. And Kaylee, he's said repeatedly, including at the podium yesterday, that he is not going to betray the trust of his members as long as this conversation is ongoing. He's going to essentially remain on the sidelines as he's dealing with a couple of different factions. And by the way, the faction calling for Joe Biden to step down remains pretty small.
Yeah.
At a 213, we're still not even at 20.
No, only 18 congressional Democrats have called for Joe Biden to leave the race, at least publicly. The question is, what is the true nature of the conversations that are happening behind closed doors and within the family, as the Democratic leader was alluding to in that letter?
Yes, absolutely. We have to acknowledge, though, that there were reports, including some here at Bloomberg, that a letter could be sent today following the NATO summit with dozens of Democratic House members on it. And Kaylee, we have not seen that yet.
No, we haven't. And we have a lot of questions for the Democrats in the House that we haven't heard call for Joe Biden to resign, including the one we're speaking to next. I'm pleased to say joining us is Congressman John Garamendi, the Democrat from California. Sir, welcome back to Bloomberg. Always lovely to have you on Balance of Power. First, we'd like to wish you well, as you've shared this week that you have been diagnosed with cancer. How are you feeling?
Excellent. Ready to go. Just have to be away from people to avoid getting an infection. But I'm in great health, and we're going to whip this thing in the next 3 to 5 months. The really good news is extraordinary progress has been made dealing with multiple myeloma as well as others. And guess what? Using the president's words, guess what? Remember the Biden moonshot? It is one of the ways in which the research is helping me. So thank you, Joe Biden.
Well, that's remarkable to hear. Congressman, you've been on our minds as a frequent voice here on Bloomberg TV and radio, and we appreciate you sharing that with us. And we do hope that you're well, because we're having a difficult conversation about aging right now in Washington. Yep. You are supporting Joe Biden through this time, and I wonder if you can explain to our viewers and listeners why, because we're hearing from voices, Congressman, every day telling us that it's already over.
Well, it is not over at all. In fact, anybody that's been paying attention and not listening to the feeding frenzy would realize, yes, Joe Biden had a very bad debate, no doubt about it. However, Donald Trump had a worse debate. He refused to answer any questions, lied repeatedly, as is his tendency to do that. Remember during his 4 years in office, 30,000 lies? Well, he added up a few more during that debate. The fact of the matter is, after that debate, the president has been very, very strong, both on the stump, ad-libbing, off of the teleprompter, absolutely strong. And 3 days with NATO leaders, we're talking about an assembly of more than 25 NATO leaders that worked with the president over the previous 3 days, and then the press conference yesterday. If you were looking for problems in the press conference, hey, you found 2 flubs. Big deal. We'll undoubtedly have a flub or 2 of my own on this, and maybe even 1 or 2 of yours. But the reality is he went through an entire litany of international affairs, from China to Russia, the Philippines, the Pacific, and NATO. He did all of that in depth and proving that he's on top of the issues, including the domestic issues. So what's the problem here? The problem here is a bad debate and a whole bunch of willy-nillys that are scared to death of their own shadow. We have a very seasoned president that can carry on. Can he do it for 4 years? Tell you and I, are we going to be around for 4 years? We never know the day. But we do know that we have a great team because we have a vice president that is ready to go should it ever be necessary.
Well, Congressman, I appreciate what you're saying about the debate being a singular bad night. Certainly, that is what we have heard from the president. The fact is, though, polling has showed and has done consistently that the vast majority of Americans just think President Biden is too old to serve. Many more than think the same about Donald Trump, who is just 3 years younger. And I wonder if it's a question of whether these all need to be mutually exclusive. Is it not possible that President Biden could have the chops on foreign policy, could be an honest, good man, as clearly you believe him to be, and still not be the best person to beat Donald Trump in November?
No, that's incorrect. What we have is a president that over the previous 3.5 years has proven that he's on top of all of the issues, including this week. This is not something that is new for him. This week, dealing with the heads of state, NATO heads of state, he proved to them and anybody that cared to listen to what the outcome of that meeting was, he proved that he is on top of the issue and that he is the leader for the free world. Bottom line, he proved that to all of those heads of state that attended the NATO conference. That's this week. Now, going forward, he's also shown that he can handle the press. He did that with skill, with determination, and with a great deal of insight and information. For more than an hour, he stood. Now, just, 3 weeks ago, we had the White House picnic. We're talking about 90-degree heat. We're talking about Republicans with their families, Democrats with their families, lined up to greet the president. And he worked that rope line for more than an hour and a half. And those that were last in line got the same effort, the same energy, the same greeting that those that were first in line. This man can do it, and he has shown it. What he has not been able to overcome is the feeding frenzy. But that will also happen in the days ahead as he continues, probably in the next couple of hours, in Michigan. Once again, showing anybody that cares to listen and honestly evaluate that he is capable, that he's on the game. Now, what is not being considered is that he has a team, not only his staff, but he has a vice president who has been with him for 3.5 years now, and has proven herself to be very capable. International affairs, international travel, understanding the world around her, understanding domestic, and importantly, pointing out that Trump will take away the fundamental rights that women once had before Trump put into office the most conservative Supreme Court perhaps in the history of America. That's what Trump did. And Kamala Harris is out there pointing out to the world and pointing out to American women, beware of another 4 years of Trump, because Project 2025 has clearly stated that they're going to take away nationally the right to women's health care.
Well, and that's something that Joe Biden's talking about today in Detroit is 2025. You mentioned Kamala Harris, obviously from California. A lot of folks are looking at the vice president now for obvious reasons, Congressman. You can speak to her veracity as a candidate, but I have to ask you, and I wouldn't say this, wouldn't ask this of just anyone, but if we're being honest here, you're right in the middle of these two guys when it comes to age. Donald Trump is 78, Joe Biden is 81. And this has been compared, this idea of a cognitive test, to taking away the car keys from an older member of your family. And I think a lot of people can relate with how complicated and difficult that is.
Wait a minute.
Do you think that both of these candidates should agree to a cognitive test? What's good for one is good for the other.
If there's going to be a cognitive test, let's not have a kindergarten cognitive test, which is what Trump continually talks about. If there's going to be a cognitive test, yes, both should. But I would like to see Donald Trump stand in front of the international press corps, as Biden did yesterday, and answer the questions, answer the detailed questions about international relationships, detailed questions about national security. And I'd like him also to explain to the international press why he spent 4 years as president, basically tearing apart NATO and handing the keys to Putin. And I remember the press conference in Helsinki. I remember what happened there. And all of us, now that we have Russia invading Ukraine, all of us should be aware of what's going on. And oh, by the way, who did Trump meet with yesterday in Mar-a-Lago? He met with Orban. Who did Orban meet with a week ago? Putin. Isn't it interesting that Orban goes, meets with Putin, and then meets with Trump? What are those two guys dealing with right now? What are they up to? What do we have to look forward to? Oh, I remember very well what happened to Jimmy Carter when Reagan and his troops cut a deal with the Iran Ayatollah and leaving Jimmy Carter to hang out there. And what happened 3 months after Reagan became president? Yeah, we had the Iran-Contra deal. That's what we had. So what is Trump up to? What is Orban up to? You need to ask those questions of those two characters. And by the way, you and I saw Biden immediately as the run-up to the Ukraine war, rallying the support for Ukraine, rallying NATO, putting NATO back together again, and adding Finland and Sweden. That is what the President of the United States did during his tenure. Can he carry on? He gave every indication yesterday that he can. And if somewhere along the way, and every single one of us is subject to this, whether you are Kamala Harris's age, or whether you're your age or you're 17 years of age, we don't know when our day will arrive. But should it arrive, should it ever arrive, for the very best quarterback that we could put on the field in the run-up to the most important political Super Bowl of all, that would be Biden. But if he can't carry on for whatever reason, then we have Harris. And I've worked with Harris since 1992, when she was the district attorney for San Francisco. We were going after bad guys then, as insurance commissioner and as city attorney. She is competent, capable, smart, and she's not going to be pushed around. And she is out there campaigning today on behalf of American women. So let's look at this. We have a team. We have a great quarterback, proven quarterback.
We're just about out of time,
this past day. I know I'm going to have to shut this down, but I ain't beginning. I've only begun to push for Biden and what we need to do.
He's closing the place today. Congressman John Garamendi. Thank you, Congressman, for answering our questions. We only ever wish we had more time. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenevec on Bloomberg Radio.
And a very good afternoon, everybody. Happy Friday, live on Bloomberg Radio, TV, YouTube, and Bloomberg Originals. This is Bloomberg Business Week. Carol Masser along with Tim Stenevec. Back from Seattle in New York, and we brought the Green Festival to Wall Street because there's a lot of green
a lot
on
of
Wall
green
Street.
on the screen. A broad-based equity rally, Carol. The S&P 500 hitting an intraday high
on track for its 38th, count it, record close this year.
Unbelievable. You've got about 90% of the names in the S&P 500 or higher. The 11 major industry groups in the S&P, they are all gaining ground today. So we are pretty much at our best levels of the session. Having said that, a lot of it has to do with expectations that the Fed is on track to cut rates come September. So it's really been a change in the U.S. rate narrative, I feel like, again this week. We're going to dig into the trade and that narrative in just a moment.
Yeah, plus we're all in on bank earnings this afternoon. JP Morgan, Citi, Wells Fargo, the quarterly reviews, and the broader commentary, plus a look ahead to next week, which includes Goldman Sachs.
Yeah, a lot of names. I always care what Jamie Dimon, and I think the street does, has to say. So we'll get into that. Then we're going to take a look at EVs. They're on the move today. We're going to get into Rivian, what is going on with that, kind of the Tesla haters, maybe finding an option in Rivian. It's a great Business Week story. That anti-Tesla crowd apparently finding some opportunities. But what is the Rivian business model going forward? We're going to tackle that.
And Carol and I were tuning into that press conference as we were flying back from Seattle last night. A high-stakes moment for President Biden, another one coming up on Monday. We're going to check in with the team in D.C. about what we have to watch for.
And one more thing. Hey, all you flex workers, we've got a home for you. It's on the French Riviera, so we're going to get into that in just a moment.
Sounds good.
All right, yeah, let's get there. All right, let's get to the trade and your top business stories. Here is Charlie Pellet.
Lots going on with this U.S. stock market as we head toward the closing bell. 2 hours away right now. About 90% of stocks in the S&P 500 index are trading higher. Not just higher. In fact, we're looking at a record right now. As Carol mentioned, will be number 38 of the year. Right now, we got the S&P at 5650. That is a gain of 1.2%. Right to the numbers here. The Dow surging, also at a record up 445, up right now by 1.1%. The Nasdaq Composite Index up 255. That is a gain right now of 1.4%. Your 10-year, 4.18%. The 2-year at 4.46%. Cannot ignore, by the way, the Russell 2000 up again today, building on yesterday's 3.6% advance, up another 1.2%. The 10-year, as I mentioned, 4.18%. Spot gold up $1.86. Little change there, up just about 0.1%, 24.17 the ounce. And West Texas Intermediate crude lower now by 0.1%. 82.48 for a barrel of WTI. Bottom line here, stocks trading at records, number 38 of the year potentially for the S&P 500 index. Banks, however, in the red after earnings reports this morning. Arshan Ali Basik's going to have a whole lot more on the banks coming up for you in just a moment. But Wells Fargo down now by 5.9%. JP Morgan Chase down 1%. Citigroup after earnings down now by 2.1%. Recapping, Russell 2000 surging again today, up another 1.2%, 10-year 4.18%. The Dow, Nasdaq, Dow and S&P both at records. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. You mentioned the big banks, and you're right. Shinali's here. Earnings season, folks, you know, officially underway. 3 of the big ones already reporting: JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, and Wells Fargo. They were out this morning before the open. A bit of a mixed bag on what some would say maybe is a bit of a tough backdrop. I'm looking at the stocks. Citi is down 2%, Tim, as we speak. JP Morgan just a little bit lower, down about 1% or just shy. But Wells Fargo really taking the hit. The biggest on a percentage basis, down about 6%.
Yeah, 3 of my decliners that you just mentioned just now, certainly. Hey, all 3 sold off earlier in the session. You just heard from Carol the latest, and Charlie when it came to those numbers. With our bank earnings roundup, with us is Bloomberg News Global Finance correspondent Shinali Basik. She's here in our Bloomberg studio. Also, Cheryl Pate, Senior Portfolio Manager at Angel Oak Capital, joins us as well. Cheryl joins us from Atlanta. Okay, Shinali, the good, the bad, the mixed, the results from the 3. Give us the highlights.
Wow. So the good news is that you did see a tick upward, for example, in investment banking fees at a lot of places. JP Morgan, that was 50% higher. The bad news is that, for example, at Wells Fargo, you saw weakness compared to what was expected in net interest income.
We knew that was coming, though.
You know, yes, but the thing here is you did see, interestingly, yesterday, for example, when the CPI print was released and you saw that sharp move lower in yields, you actually saw the biggest U.S. banks sell off and the regional banks rally. And the reason you saw that was because even though you're seeing rates potentially come down, I think there's a massive question on what does this mean for that mix that banks have. What happens to the deposits, but also what happens to the money that's being made from the loans that are being put out. Remember, we're looking at consumers with tons of credit card debt right now. You're seeing charge-offs starting to rise. Provisions for loan losses were higher than expected at JP Morgan, Fortress JP Morgan. It's not that people are really worried about, the health of JP Morgan. What they're more worried about is, okay, well, what does this say about the propensity of consumers to both take on more debt and pay that debt back?
Right, exactly. So is it mixed, do you say, in general, or is there any trend overall takeaway?
Well, think about it. All the big stocks are lower today after earnings, and not by a really small margin. They had a really significant run out into this moment. You've seen JP Morgan, Wells both up more than 20%, Citigroup almost 30%. Citigroup still trading at around 66% or so of book value, maybe a little less right now. But, the setup was pretty good going into this. The future is super uncertain.
Yeah, that's fair. I think that is so fair. Let's get to Cheryl. Cheryl, come on in on the conversation, listening to Sonali, who is usually up, at the wee hours and breaking it down and sending us all messages about the results. What's your takeaway about the three big banks that reported today?
Yeah, no, I think it's a similar perspective here. I really think a lot of the reaction today really hinges on the forward guidance. And I think, there may have been some expectations that there may have been some upside to some of the guidance. The fact that JP Morgan reiterated, I think, was a little disappointing. And then, Wells on the other side guiding to the high end in terms of NIM compression or NII compression certainly was disappointing. So we've been focused on guidance, on NIM, and on credit. And I think that the question mark really is on the forward guidance, and we didn't get a lot there.
Sonali, Jamie Dimon, we always listen when he speaks, whether it's a letter to investors, an annual report, or an earnings call. Commentary from Jamie Dimon, anything of note?
He wasn't there today. He was out celebrating the bank's 100th anniversary in Germany. He was in Frankfurt.
Is that notable?
It's interesting. When Jamie Dimon sneezes, everybody catches a cold, right?
Is that what happened to me? Is that why my voice
If
is
he
like
doesn't
this?
sound like Tim Stenovic, a deeper Tim Stenovic, it is Tim Stenovic.
People want to look for a deeper meaning. You look at Morgan Stanley, for example, and just kind of how sluggish the stock has been relative to the other banks. Given that there has been a big change in leadership there, so much confidence in James Gorman, people are looking for direction from Ted Pick and who he is as a leader.
Yeah.
And if Jamie Dimon were to step down, then the same questions arise for JP Morgan, perhaps on a bigger scale. So people do look for direction, but perhaps, like many leaders are doing right now, giving deputies time to breathe and make their mark is prudent coming into the next cycle.
So, Sonali, is that another sign that you know where I'm going with this?
You can't read into things, though. That's the thing.
We can't read into this?
I don't think so. He steps down when he steps down.
He does, but he's also made some moves in the past few months about potential successors, and
But
also
I've got to say, can I
talked for
tell
the
you
first
something?
time.
For 10 years, man, this guy has been making moves.
Didn't he say something different a few months ago?
He said that, that 5 years thing that he always said, that has gone away. The horizon is certainly smaller.
Okay.
The bigger question for me is, are his deputies ready? Is Jen Pipsack ready? She's the one that people are watching the most.
Some would say he's being, maybe really responsible as a leader to make sure that bench is ready to take over. I want to bring Cheryl back in. You're hearing us talk about Jamie Dimon, and we know there's more than JP Morgan, but we do focus on it. What is your thinking about the outlook for this company, and then kind of who takes over and when they take over from Jamie Dimon?
Yeah, I think that's been a question for a number of years, clearly, as some of the commentary already. Look, I think this was a good opportunity to have some more people in the forefront, and I think it was done well on the conference call today. Timing, I think, is still uncertain, and perhaps maybe it's dependent on where we go from an economic perspective here too. The data now is somewhat supportive of moving towards rate cuts and hopefully a soft landing, no landing type scenario, which may be more opportune than a more hard landing scenario.
Cheryl, I want to shift gears to Citi a little bit. Citi's down 2%. It's off its lows of the day, down 3.6% at its lows today. Citi warning that costs likely likely to be at the high end of the forecast. What was your takeaway on Citi? What do we need to know about Jane Fraser and her team and what they're doing? And as Sonali mentioned, I mean, this is another one up 25% so far this year.
Yeah, no, I think the execution so far has been good on the restructuring plan, and you know, we are positive on the name for that reason. I think, you know, this loops into the forward guidance, and expenses have been you know, troublesome for the whole sector for some time, and moving to the higher end of the range again here, I think puts more uncertainty onto the forward look. I think more of what will drive Citi looking forward, though, is going to be execution on restructuring, and also working to deploy some of that excess capital. And I thought the buyback commentary was helpful from that perspective today.
Cheryl, what is your favorite choice among the banks and why?
You know, I think today we would say JP Morgan would be our top pick. We do like the large cap banks generally, given more diversification. We clearly saw that come through in the capital markets revenue. And I think, you know, JP Morgan was the standout winner there today. But also in case of looking towards any wobbles in credit going forward, the prudence, the fortress balance sheet concept, I think really stands the test of time in a more difficult environment. So that's, you know, where we would put our top pick today.
Hey, just to wrap up, guys, just got about 60 seconds. Cheryl, let me start with you, and then we'll go to Sonali. Next week, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America. What is on your radar, Cheryl?
I think we're mostly watching for credit, particularly from Bank of America, and then starting to get in some of the regional banks. We've clearly been concerned about commercial real estate exposure, but also some weakening in the consumer side. I think we were encouraged today with the comments from JP Morgan on credit card, and also Citi, that it's just regular sort of normal course normalization, seasoning of vintages. But I think that'll be important to see out of Bank of America. And then, you know, the Goldmans and Morgans of the world. Clearly, it's been a good quarter for capital markets, particularly strong investment banking revenues and equity trading.
Sonali, very briefly, next week, Bank of America, what are you looking for in Goldman Sachs?
In addition to what Cheryl was saying about credit quality, I'm also watching for trading, because if you saw fixed income coming in a little light at JP Morgan and even Citigroup, that's a big business for Goldman Sachs. They have been leaning in on prime brokerage. And of course, Morgan Stanley equities trading as well was a huge bright spot this quarter so far. Let's see how that competition plays out.
All right, great setup of what's going on today, and then, of course, into next week. Sonali Bostic, thank you so much. As always, we always appreciate your input and the research you send us.
Pre-5 a.m. arrival this morning.
This kid doesn't sleep. Yeah. Global finance correspondent at Bloomberg News. And Cheryl Pate, our thanks to you as well in the analysis. Senior portfolio manager at Angel Oak Capital Advisors there in Atlanta. The KBW Bank Index, little change, and actually, most of the names are higher in today's session.
Okay, so now to our other big focus this week, and that was two prints on inflation. Fed Chair Jay Powell updating U.S. lawmakers on the economy and monetary policy, and then how it all played out in moves along the Treasury curve. Carol, safe to say, a reset on rates again, which makes us wonder, have we topped out?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we've got a great person to answer it. Back with us is Bloomberg News rates reporter Michael McKenzie. He's out there in New Jersey. All right, Michael, another inflation print today. We had one yesterday. We definitely did see the Treasury curve move. How are you kind of adding it all together? Have we topped out when it comes to some of the levels that we've seen on the Treasury curve?
I think that's a pretty reasonable conclusion to draw, Carol. I think some of the rally you're now seeing this week is actually, one investor described to me as a bit of FOMO. People who missed the top in yield back in April when we were around 475, for example, in 5 years, are now having to buy because the data is slowing, and the inflation print we got yesterday on CPI was really important because there was a bit of anxiety going into that. But the fact that it came below expectations, the fact that it shows that the Fed has probably done enough here in terms of tightening interest rate policy since 2022, that they are going to win the fight on inflation, and they are going to get it closer towards that 2% target. And I think you're now going to get the market beginning. We've seen some big trades go through Fed funds futures today where people are beginning to speculate on whether the Fed will go 50 in September. I think that's not on the table at all at the moment. But it is interesting to see when you look at rate cut expectations for 2025, they're beginning to build again. There's this expectation in the bond market that the Fed's going to do a lot more easing than people think, or at least what the Fed says they're going to do by next year. So I think there is a bit of FOMO going on. Retail sales next Tuesday will be an important piece of data. And I think really it'll be the next couple of payroll numbers that we get, because if the labor market softens further, then I think you definitely get the cut in September. You might even get another one in November.
Michael, we often ask you about a peak on the 10-year, but how low could the 10-year go this year? What are the traders you speak to?
There's chatter today that you're going to see a 3 handle on the 10-year. I think.
Wait, you said 3 handle? You said a 3 handle.
Yeah, this year. Get below 4%. I think, again, we're in this tricky period now where the inflation number was such a good number for the bond market. You just cannot really assess just how big this buying is going to come in to drive prices down. I'm actually drive prices up and yields down, sorry. So, and we have been here before. We've had these big pivot trades that have been put on the last couple of years. But the CPI was also, it came after 2 days of testimony from Chair Powell.
Right.
And he kind of brought back the dual mandate for the Fed here. He said, we're watching employment. And I think if you get cracks in labor over the next couple of months, you're definitely going to see the bond market rally harder.
So I am thinking, we all are thinking about Monday at 12:30 p.m. Wall Street time, when Fed Chair Jay Powell will be interviewed by David Rubenstein at the Economic Club of Washington, D.C. Powell asked for this conversation. Is this kind of a victory speech, a little bit, or I don't know? How are you?
I don't think he's going to play it that way. I think he's going to continue to be pretty careful. The one speech you really got to look forward to, I think, is the end of August at Jackson Hole, because that'll be about 20 days before the September 18th Fed meeting, and that's going to be the pivotal one, because then you'll have seen more data. Don't forget, they're very data dependent. They keep telling us they're data dependent. I think Monday he'll stick to the script, the recent script. They're looking at both the labor market, they're looking at inflation. He's probably has more confidence that inflation's coming down. Don't forget, this week he said they didn't have enough confidence. So there may be, he could get the market fired up again if he says we do have confidence. But I think he's going to be pretty cautious still. But I think that Jackson Hole speech he makes at the end of August, that's going to be the big thing, the big event for the market.
Michael, just 30 seconds. What about the July 31st Federal Reserve meeting? Is there any chatter of a rate cut there?
No.
Why not?
I think you just haven't seen enough data. I think the Fed has made it pretty clear they want to see a series of data prints. The inflation is moving in the right direction. Labor market, unemployment rates ticked up over 4%. That's not enough to get the Fed to really think about, bringing rate cuts forward. They want to give themselves, plenty of flexibility still. But everyone I've spoken to this week, even people who didn't think September was in play before, now say it's in play, and they expect a cut in September based on what we're currently seeing in the data.
What an amazing week. Again. Michael McKenzie, have a great weekend. Bloomberg News rates reporter Michael McKenzie out there in New Jersey. Coming up next, everybody, the EV maker for the anti-Elon group. Yes, there is one, and yet, can it really make money? We're going to get into this Bloomberg Business Week story. That's next.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. S&P 500 index at a record 5648, up right now by 1.1%. Dow Industrials 40,201, also at a record, up 1.1%. The Dow now rallying by 447 points. NASDAQ is gaining as well, up 241, up 1.3%. Perhaps the big story, though, today is the broadening of the rally and also another move higher today for the NASDAQ 100 index. That is up by 1.4%. The Russell 2000 up an additional 1.3% after yesterday's surge of more than 3.5%. 10-year on this PPI Friday, 4.18%. The 2-year, 4.46%. Spot gold flat on the day now, $24.15 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude oil down 0.3%, 82.34 for a barrel of WTI. Novo Nordisk's Ozempic has been linked to lower rates of dementia and a range of other mental problems in a University of Oxford study that raises expectations about the diabetes drug's potential ancillary benefits. Novo Nordisk rallying today by just about 2%. Bottom line here, we're looking at a potential 38th record of the year for the S&P, now at 5646, up 1.1%. We've got the Russell 2000 up 1.3%, and the 10-year 4.18%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. All right, folks, Tesla, always on our radar, it feels like. Shares of Tesla did sell off earlier today. I think I'm just going to take
they've turned around. They're up 3.8% now.
Yeah, we've definitely seen like a rally. I
Round
feel like
trip,
the whole
right?
market, right? A little bit. Yesterday, we did see the trade, though. There was some pressure. The stock today was downgraded by UBS on concerns that the U.S. electric car maker shares have risen too much too soon, that's their words, on optimism over its artificial intelligence plans. In the meantime, Tim, we've got another story on our radar when it comes to Tesla, or should I say the anti-Tesla crowd.
Yeah, the other EV startup that's persuading buyers to drop $70,000 on its EVs, but still has a big hurdle to get over, and that is making money. The story is in the upcoming issue of Bloomberg Business Week. It's coming out next week. It's the August issue. We've got with us a Bloomberg Technology co-host, Ed Ludlow. He joins us on his Business Week story in our San Francisco bureau. Ed, you know a lot about Tesla. You know a lot about Rivian. This is the focus of the story that you wrote with Max Chafkin. How is the company doing?
It's hard to say, and we wrote 4,000 words, so you'd think we'd come to a conclusion.
It's a great story.
You know, so thank you guys. Good. Where have you two been? All over the place, West Coast, East Coast again. Look, you guys kind of teed it up really well.
Riding in a lot of EVs we have been, I will say that. Different types.
And I'm really grateful for you guys getting hands-on with that world. Like, the point or the open of the 4,000-word Business Week article is that Rivian, or the first iteration of it, was like the anti-Elon, anti-Tesla. Tesla had small form factor cars, Model 3, Model Y. They have Elon, and we, you know, Elon is divisive. I think that's a fair and objective thing to say, frankly. And so in the first instance, Rivian was able to sell its kind of very large SUV and very large pickup to that kind of market, somebody that didn't want a Tesla but wanted an EV, or just didn't like to be associated with Elon's products, but it had a super limited shelf life. Now they've hit reset. They are on Rivian 2.0, and we went super detailed on the strategy to actually stop burning through billions of dollars and start making some money down the road.
Okay, Ed, I have a sort of a how the sausage is made question for you, because I imagine while you were reporting this story, news of that $5 billion investment from VW came in.
Oh, so without betraying confidence, it's brilliant timing. It gives the story new life and energy. Like, the way that I would put it is like Volkswagen almost comes in at the 11th hour. And because an injection of $5 billion certainly helps. Even if the story is that you're burning through billions anyway, having some more billions is good. But Max and I certainly got the sense a few weeks ago that something was happening. And I've got a pretty good track record, right? I've broken quite a lot of news on Rivian, frankly, and I just had no idea. I didn't see it coming. You know, we did learn the backstory, which is that Oliver Bloom and Volkswagen were admirers of Rivian. RJ Scaringe, the CEO of Rivian, met with Oliver Bloom about less than a year ago, but like last summer in Atlanta, Georgia, where Porsche has its kind of excellence center. It's somewhere you can visit. And he rocks up, and in the parking lot, they've got some Rivians. And he's like, oh, that's kind of neat. But the idea is like all car companies benchmark against each other by testing other people's vehicles. And they kind of went from there. And the main thing you need to know is that Rivian needed money, and it has some access to that now. But it's also kind of a big vote of credibility for Rivian, that Volkswagen would turn to them to fix some of Volkswagen's own problems in this kind of shift we're seeing to electric drivetrain.
And yet, Rivian, if you go back to late 2021, was a $172 a share stock. It is down more than 20% this year. I said it used to be $172 a share. It's $18.52 a share today. So if it seems like it has so much potential, how come investors aren't really necessarily, buying up shares?
Yeah, the concern has been, does it ever move beyond being a niche player? It built 52,000 EVs across its 2 consumer cars and a van for Amazon last year. It will probably do 57,000 this year. How does it get to the 400,000 that Tesla does each quarter? And at one point, its market cap was lower than the cash it had on its balance sheet. And one way of interpreting that is that the market values the car business at basically zero. And so cue the R2. The R2 is a smaller form factor SUV. They have a new plan on how they're going to build it. It's going to go from their existing plant in Illinois instead of Georgia, where they still plan to build a factory in the future. That's going to be, they hope, the Model 3 moment, like Tesla went through. Finally, a mass market car. And the question that we pose, or at least Brad Stone says now that we want to answer questions in Business Week, I think we explain how the R2 is going to get Rivian there based on interviews with RJ Scaringe, the CEO. And it's not going to be easy, but they have really thought about it.
Can we think about it, the R2 being like the Model 3 for Tesla?
Yeah. So in scale.
Yeah.
But I think, go back to what we started the conversation on. The initial buyers were the early adopters, the people that didn't want a Model 3, so they wanted an SUV. And Rivian had the only 3-row SUV on the market. But most people just want, the RAV4, Toyota RAV4 or Honda CR-V equivalent. And it doesn't really exist yet. The problem Rivian's got is that they've said, here, we have it. It's $45,000, the R2. Them and everyone else. Everyone's going to have this little SUV in the $35,000 to $45,000 range coming in the next 2 years. So it's about kudos to Rivian for also being quite good at technology. The products are really good. They've just not been very good at building them. They're a startup, right? That's grown super fast. And time to grow up, get rid of the teething problems.
But that, you just hit on it, right? That's the holy grail, though. Whether you're Tesla, whether you're Rivian, it's not about spending $70,000 or $80,000 for an EV. If you're really going to build out your business, you've got to get to that middle market, right? Or less expensive market. That's where you scale up.
Yeah, and I think that the reason I really enjoyed the process is I covered Rivian starting when it was 40 people or whatever, and now it's 13,000. And we kind of really get into the head of CEO, RJ Scaringe. And, he was generous with his time in terms of interviews and of course, spoke to a lot of sources. But I think the penny dropped for him that he needed this R2 to materialize more quickly. And that's why they're going to build it at their existing factory in Illinois, not Georgia, because they can do it 6 months faster than they had originally planned, knowing that all that competition is going to do something at the same time.
Ed, very briefly, because there's a lot we want to get to in the last 3 minutes with you.
Yeah.
Last question on this. One of my big takeaways was RJ Scaringe really finds himself in the right place at the right time, whether it's MIT or whether it's with Lauren Sanchez.
Oh, sure.
Tell us about that.
So, in short, RJ is an incredibly impressive person. He is kind. He is held in high regard by everyone that I've spoken to, takes incredible care of himself physically. He's a micromanager from an engineering standpoint. The question is it's hard being a startup CEO, founder CEO. He's been also brilliant at deal making. And so I also kind of explain in the magazine, he's been an unreliable boyfriend. The deals with Ford and Mercedes to do joint ventures and joint EVs, what happened to those? And so now with VW, he gave me a pretty strong response when I put that to him about why VW is going to work. And the answer basically was we've proved that we're good at this. We'll see. Yeah.
All right. So listen, great story, killer story in the upcoming new issue of Bloomberg Business Week. So we highly recommend everybody check it out. That new issue should be out next week. Having said that, we also want to get to an exclusive from you and Dana Hall yesterday about Tesla postponing its robotaxi unveiling to October.
Okay. Ed, when Ed joined us to talk about this a few months ago, we said, Ed, is this really going to happen in August? Because next year, autonomous has been the big joke for about 8 or 9 years when it comes to, well, a decade at this point, to Tesla. So not it surprised the market. We saw shares close down by more than 8%. Was it a surprise to you?
Well, it wasn't a surprise to me because, like, our job, right? In the course of our reporting, we spoke to sources and they said, yeah, it's delayed to October. The reason, according to the sources, is that I think Tesla and Elon wanted more to show. They wanted more prototypes to actually unveil when the event happens. One source told me that even as recently as this week, Elon requested that the design team make changes to the design of the robotaxi. So as we always say, Elon's often late on the timelines or deadlines he publicly states, but he also often gets there at the end. And I think the anxiety in the share price was it had been on an 11-day winning run. RSI for the technos or technicals out there was like in the high 80s. And so much emphasis has been put on this pivot, that Tesla in the long term, making EVs and selling them to consumers will be a small part of the business relative to software sales or running on autonomous robotaxi business.
Yeah, fascinating. I'm looking at RSI too, Relative Strength Index, and it's still pretty much overbought at this point. So you're right, it has had quite a run as of late. Ed, so great to go around the world when it comes to EVs with you. So appreciate it. Have a great weekend. Our Ed Ludlow, he is co-host of Bloomberg Technology on Bloomberg Television. Catch them every day at 11 a.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg TV. And I'm looking at Tesla shares up 4% today. Little change though. Year to date, but as Ed has mentioned, quite a pop in the last couple of weeks or so.
Well, speaking of a pop, Rivian shares up by 11.5% as we speak.
All right, so something to keep on our radar. Hey, still ahead, we're going to get to the latest test for President Biden and his political future as Bloomberg Business Week continues on radio and on television. We'll be right back in just a moment.
For more, though, let's get on checking the latest world and national news. We got Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington, D.C. Hey, Nance.
Thanks, Tim. President Biden is hitting the campaign trail today, heading to Michigan for an evening event. During last night's hour-long news conference, Biden spoke confidently about a range of complex issues, from the tax code and trade policy to Russia and the Israel-Hamas war. He did, however, have a few gaffes, which is still worrying some Democrats. Biden says he plans to stay in the race to finish the job he started. Following this week's NATO summit, questions are lingering about the future relationship between the U.S. and the alliance. If Donald Trump is elected president, he's made no secret he does not see NATO's value. But NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg tells Bloomberg he expects the U.S. will stay the course.
The United States will remain a strong NATO ally because this also makes the United States safer and stronger. The United States is big, 25% of the world's GDP, but together with NATO allies, we are 50% of the world's GDP.
Again, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. President Biden has posted on X that Israel and Hamas have agreed to a, quote, framework for a ceasefire deal using the plan he laid out in May that would result in the release of hostages. The details now being worked out with help from administration officials. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. This is Bloomberg.
Street, we do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ 100 index, Russell 2000, all pushing higher. Records right now for both the Dow and the S&P 500 index. The Russell 2000 building on yesterday's surge. Yesterday, you recall, that index was up 3.6%. Right now, we've got the Russell 2000 up by 1.3%. Here's where we stand. S&P now at a record 56.49, up 65, close to session highs, up 1.2%. The Dow is advancing 427 points, up 1.1%. NASDAQ Composite Index up 255, a gain right now of 1.4%. 10-year, 4.18%. The 2-year, 4.46%. Gold, lower a little change, down 75 the ounce to 24.14. And West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.6%, 82.10 right now for a barrel of WTI. Bottom line here, stocks climbing to records as the latest economic data reinforces bets that the Fed will be cutting rates in September. Broad-based rally with roughly 90% of the shares in the S&P 500 index pushing higher. The one notable exception, bank stocks after earnings, they're lower. Wells Fargo down now by 6.2%. JP Morgan Chase down 1.1%. Citigroup down now by 1.6%. Again, recapping, stocks higher, S&P up 65, up 1.2%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It is indeed. All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Well, safe to say it was one of the most politically anticipated events in a while. No doubt about it. I was watching on the plane last night. I had my phone watching Bloomberg, and then I flipped to one of the networks on the TV screen once we took off.
Okay, you were a few seats away from me.
Yes.
Everybody in my row was watching it. And what we're talking about is the press conference that was very late for President Biden.
Yeah.
Scheduled for 4:30. Then moved to 5:30, then moved to 6:30, and then finally it happened.
It took a while. Joe and Kayleigh were like counting it down and doing all the prep into it. You have to remember, though, this is coming just after, a couple of weeks after another very much anticipated political event. 2 weeks ago, it was the first presidential debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Last night, of course, it was, as Tim mentioned, President Biden's news conference at the NATO summit. Really a make or break moment, many are saying, in his quest to really quiet what's become a drumbeat, a growing drumbeat of concerns at home and abroad about his 2024 presidential campaign.
I'm determined on running, but I think it's important that I allay fears by let them see me out there. Let me see them out. For the longest time it was, Biden's not prepared to sit with us unscripted. Biden's not prepared to, anyway.
That, of course, was President Biden last night at that press conference. He took a lot of questions about whether or not he's going to continue or is fit to continue.
Hey, with more, let's get to Bloomberg News White House and politics reporter Gregory Cordy, who joins us from our Washington, D.C. bureau. So, Gregory, win, lose, or draw last night for President Biden and his performance and his hope to allay fears about his capacity to be at the top of the ticket?
Yeah, I'm always reluctant to be definitive on these kinds of things and kind of stay within the reporting and not the punditry. And also I'll have some caveats that the data is still coming in. We're still looking at members of Congress continuing today to urge him to drop out. We're going to want to look at the polls. But my first reaction was it's probably a wash. He didn't win back any of the critics that had called for him to step aside and let somebody else carry the top of the ticket. But on the other hand, he probably didn't do himself a whole lot of damage either. He stood for 59 minutes, asked questions from 11 different reporters, had some notable misstatements and stumbles, as he always does, trailed off his train of thought often, but for the most part, talked about policy, talked about his age, talked about him being in the race. He didn't really address his critics head on very often. His answers to the age questions were a lot shorter than his answers, for example, to the Ukraine and NATO questions, which went on for several minutes. But the world was watching to see if this guy could stand up and hold a press conference for an hour, and he did.
Yeah, he certainly did. I actually, we were a little tired on our trip in Seattle, and I did nod off towards the end of the press conference. Nothing to say. I was just tired. So Biden kept going, but I did not. Having said that, Gregory, I do wonder, what are the clear narratives? I feel like there's very clear narratives coming from D.C. and really the media in terms of President Biden and pressure for him to step aside. As you said, the polling is starting to happen. I'm just curious about the electorate, and the citizens who will actually go and vote in November. What are we hearing from them? Is there some disconnect?
You know, it is July, and so really, most voters are not super plugged in, although this has been a story that really has been unavoidable over the past 2 weeks. What we have seen in the polls is that after that initial debate that he had, that everybody concedes was disastrous, he stumbled in the poll. He slipped a little bit in some of the major polls. I'm talking about the New York Times Siena poll, the Wall Street Journal poll, slipped 2-3 points in those national polls. He did better in our morning consult poll that we do of swing states. But it seems to me, my reading of the polls right now is that we've sort of felt the bottom now, and that Biden is still trailing Trump nationally and in the swing states, but the slide in his ratings has abated somewhat. But having said that, when you talk to Democratic voters and you say, who will you vote for? They'll say Biden. If you ask them, would you rather have somebody other than Biden at the top of the ticket? Growing numbers, perhaps even a majority, are now saying yes.
So let's talk about more data and the data that we're starting to see. Kamala Harris, the vice president, President Biden was asked about her last night. He had very complimentary things to say about her. Gregory, how is she doing in the polls against President Trump?
Yeah, it's sort of a trick question, right? Because Biden can't say, well, she's not ready to do the job yet because he picked her. And her whole job description is to be ready to step in for him. So, yeah, he did say that she would be ready. The question in his mind is, would I lose against Trump? And if I would somebody else do better? And the data on that is a little mixed. Depending on what the poll you look at, she's either trailing further or maybe even surpassing Biden. There's a little bit of a mismatch in these. Sometimes these are hard to read because there's a difference in name recognition. Obviously, everybody knows who Joe Biden is. He's been a mainstay of American politics for 50 years. Clearly, everybody knows who Donald Trump is. Kamala Harris has been the sitting vice president for 3.5 years. She's not an unknown commodity, but people are still sort of not quite sure how she might govern differently than Joe Biden should she take office. And so there's a little bit of an unknown factor when you get to Harris. And then certainly when you get to some of the other alternatives that have been mentioned, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, candidates like that, their name recognition is far, far below any of the other national candidates, Trump, Biden, or Harris.
Yeah, it was interesting, too. The New York Times has a story out. The Biden campaign is quietly carrying out a head-to-head survey of voters between Vice President Kamala Harris and Donald Trump in a sign of uncertainty, even atop the Democratic Party. So they apparently are doing a survey conducted this week, and it was commissioned by the Biden campaign's analytics team. What are you watching out for to get an idea that there is indeed a shift and that maybe the mechanics are going to be starting for maybe a way to smoothly have President Biden say, I'm not running anymore, and Kamala Harris is it?
Certainly continue to look at the polling, although one thing I will say about Joe Biden, and this is not uncommon to a lot of politicians, is they tend to take a rosier look at the polling than the rest of us do. Joe Biden has a history of cherry-picking just the polls that he wants to look at. And so I'm not sure that the polls will be particularly persuasive to him. We're continuing to look at congressional leadership and how they weigh in. Now, Hakeem Jeffries, the House Democratic leader, went to the White House last night and talked to Joe Biden.
Right.
Came away, told his caucus this morning that he relayed the whole panoply of concerns from within the caucus to the president. Did not seem to put his finger on the scale anywhere to say that Jeffries himself thinks that Biden should step aside or that he should stay in the race. So we're watching Chuck Schumer, the Senate Democratic leader.
Right.
But this is going to be, I think, in the end, it's going to be a closely held family decision by the Biden family.
Yeah, totally get it. That makes sense. And we're also keeping a watch. I'm curious about fundraising and starting to see any impacts there. So
yeah, we know that PAC is withholding $90 million, according to the New York Times.
Yeah, so that's significant. All right. Gregory Cordy, as always, Bloomberg News White House and politics reporter. Great stuff. Next hour, more on the president and his NATO allies and what it means for Ukraine and Russia.
Company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. AT&T suffered a massive hack of customer data separate from one reported earlier this year that included records of calls and texts for nearly all of its mobile phone users for a 6-month period in 2022. It is one of the biggest breaches of private communications data in recent memory. It is under investigation by the FCC. We do have AT&T shares now lower by 0.4%. The company said it learned in April that the information was illegally downloaded from a workspace on a third-party cloud platform, which a spokesperson identified as Snowflake. Snowflake shares down right now by just about 2.5%. Bank earnings front and center today, and stocks of JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Citigroup all lower. JP Morgan Chase did report record profit as investment bankers and equities traders at the biggest American bank. JP Morgan Chase down by 1.3%. Wells Fargo shares, they're down 6% right now. Wells has warned that it will not be able to cut costs as fast as it previously forecast this year after the banking giant posted higher than expected expenses in the second quarter. Also reporting this morning, Citigroup, it said costs for the year are now likely to be at the high end of the range it previously provided after the bank faced a series of regulatory penalties in recent months. Amazon's artificial intelligence shopping assistant Rufus is now available to all American customers following 5 months of testing with a subset of consumers. We've got Amazon shares advancing today. Right now, Amazon up by roughly 0.3%. Those are our top company stories, and this is Bloomberg.
You're listening to Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Messer and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio and Television.
It is Bloomberg Business Week, live from New York City and not the French Riviera. Let's get a check on the latest world and national news. We got Nancy Lyons in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington, D.C. Hey, Nance.
Thanks, Tim. A key ally of President Biden says he is standing by the president's re-election bid. South Carolina Democrat Jim Clyburn told NBC's Today Show the conversation needs to end over whether Biden should exit the race.
I always say the best predictor of future performance is past behavior. Let's continue to compare the past behavior of Joe Biden as to the past behavior of his opponent, Donald Trump, and let that be a guide to the reactions going forward.
At least 17 of Clyburn's colleagues in Congress have urged Biden to drop out. Just a few days left to go before the Republican National Convention, and the presidential race still seems very close. The latest NPR PBS Marist poll shows President Biden's support is relatively unchanged from last month, despite questions about his mental fitness. If the general election were held today, the poll found 50% would go with Biden, 48% would vote for Donald Trump. That's still within the margin of error. Last month, the same poll had the two tied at 49%. Well, following last night's news conference, House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries met with President Biden. In a letter, Jeffries says he directly expressed the full breadth of, quote, insight, heartfelt perspectives, and conclusions about the path forward, but he did not provide any specifics. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Nancy Lyons. Now back to you, Carol and Tim.
All right, Nance, thanks so much. Nancy Lyons there in D.C. So I could totally see our bosses signing on to this. You guys want to work from home, do the show, somewhere else? No problem. Sometimes it's Seattle and the Bloomberg Green Festival, or perhaps we do something on the French Riviera.
The reason we're talking about this is because one of the most read stories on the Bloomberg terminal is about affluent Americans who have the flexibility to work remotely buying up expensive real estate on the French Riviera. It sparked a surge in property prices in a region known for stunning beaches, fancy yachts, and the glamorous Cannes Film Festival.
Yes, indeed. So here's some stats for you. Prices of homes valued above $16 million U.S.
I think that's our first problem. That's the first obstacle.
Part?
Yeah, that's the first obstacle preventing us from doing this.
All right, so this is along France's southeastern coast, rose between 15 and 20% in the 5 years through 2023, outperforming the 13% gains in London in the same period. This is coming from the broker Beauchamp, or is that how you say it?
Did you take French in college? No, I can tell. Before we move there, you're going to have to brush up on that.
Anyway, apparently the prices are surging if you compare it against what's going on in London.
Okay, so this increase has been driven by a resurgence in international buyers after the pandemic. Those from the U.S., the Middle East, looking for second homes where they can work. According to the research, the demand for such so-called super prime homes, it's unlikely to be dented by the political turmoil that swept France following the recent snap elections. This according to the managing director of Beauchamp in Cannes.
Thank you, Beauchamp. Very nicely
Beauchamp,
done.
I don't know.
So apparently they're looking in the French Riviera, also Dubai and Miami, where they can live for long periods of the year.
What about the time zone shift? Does it mean you're working late at night?
Does it really matter that you can then walk out and be on the French Riviera? Yeah. Anyway, as we continue to have, it was interesting because we saw, all right, total contrast, what was in Seattle. We saw a lot of retail, empty retail space, a lot of occupancy in office space because people are still remote working, certainly in a city like Seattle.
A city like New York, a city like San Francisco as well. Los Angeles seeing it too.
Yeah.
A reset.
You sure,
a reset
bosses,
after
we
the
can't
pandemic.
do a remote
Yeah, funny story. Already got an email from our boss saying we cannot do this. So
I believe it was not going to happen.
Yeah, that's what it says.
What is going to happen if you're watching on TV? The close is coming your way in just a moment. Tim and I consider continuing on Bloomberg Business Week. Much more to come, including an update on the market trade. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio.
Check it out, everybody. We are just about 60 minutes away from the closing bell on this Friday, July 12th. You've got stocks, man, they are higher.
You get a record. You get a record. You get a record. I'm talking about the Dow. I'm talking about the S&P 500. I'm talking about the NASDAQ 100.
Yeah, what it would be, is it the 30?
Was it 30?
Charlie
You wrote it
Pellet,
earlier.
what are we, 38th record on the S&P?
38th on the S&P 500
there's
index
Charlie.
and moving higher. 56, 51 right now on the S&P.
Yeah, that's what it would be. Thank you so much.
Amazing.
I know.
You know what's better than AI?
It's like having our own little Oz here in,
Charlie Pellet, way better than AI.
yeah,
We don't need an AI assistant. We need we need a Charlie Pellet to walk around with us all the time.
a Charlie chatbot.
That would be consistent with what my wife says because she calls me a know-it-all.
You do know a lot. Hey, S&P 500, most names are higher, folks. 446 to the upside, only 56 losing some ground today, one unchanged.
Okay, hate to be the one who rains on the parade, but the most read story on the Bloomberg terminal
Could be a
is
poopy
about
right now.
why traders wonder if stock market history is repeating itself. Got to go back to the stock market bubble of 1999. Alex Semenova is going to be joining us in just a few minutes talking
It's
about
our
this.
most read story on the Bloomberg all day today, so looking forward to that. Also, we're going to get more on President Biden's NATO press conference last night and the
Not a lot of NATO
implications.
in there.
Well,
2 questions that I heard.
there was a fair amount. Well, yeah.
Yeah,
I
2
guess.
questions.
All
One
right.
question about Gaza.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. But we are going to talk about the implications for NATO and Ukraine and Russia. We've got a great guest on that who really understands the region and certainly what's going on.
Plus, I see Kurt Wagner patiently waiting for us. We're going to talk with him about X's pivot to video. It's not going so well. He's the man who wrote the book on Twitter, Kurt Wagner. He's going to tell us what's going on.
All right, we've already talked about EVs. We're going to get to, not an EV, but we're going to get to the first Porsche 911 hybrid. Yep, folks. And don't worry, it's not the end of the world.
You can get that along with your home in the French Riviera.
Yeah. All right, that has to do with affluence.
Yeah.
Right? Or being affluent, I should say. All right, let's get a check on the day's trade and your top business stories. Here's once again our own ChatGPT.
Hi, thank you very much indeed. We got smart guests, great radio, and glad to have you guys on board with the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ setting records. 58 minutes to go until we hit the closing bell, on track for number 38 in terms of records this year for the S&P 500 index. Right to the numbers, because I got some big round numbers. 40,200 on the Dow Jones Industrial Average, up right now by 1.1%. S&P 500 index back above 5,600, a gain right now of 1.2%. The S&P up 66 right now. NASDAQ up 1.4%. The NASDAQ 100 index also up 1.4%. But the big story that can't get lost in the headlines, Russell 2000 keeps on going, building on yesterday's gains. Yesterday, you recall, we were up 3.6% on the Russell 2000, up again today, up now by 1.4%. We've got the 10-year yielding 4.18%, the 2-year 4.45%. Gold now down 0.1%, 24.13 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.5%, 82.20 for a barrel of WTI. The latest economic data is reinforcing bets that the Federal Reserve will be cutting rates in September. Investors digesting the latest inflation report and what it means for the rate outlook. Cameron Dawson is Chief Investment Officer at New Edge Wealth.
We think that the odds of a September hike certainly went up after yesterday's data, but if we have a couple more data points that look like that PPI, maybe we do get pushed out to November. So this is still a very data-dependent Fed, and we could see this kind of saw pattern within inflation data, which could keep us kind of in an uncertain place.
Cameron Dawson of New Edge Wealth. Bank stocks lower after earnings. Just about the only red I'm looking at right now, with Wells Fargo down 5.9%. JP Morgan Chase down 1.2%. Citigroup down by 1.1%. Recapping stocks higher. S&P at a record. We have got, as is the Dow, the S&P up by 1.2%. The Dow up 1.1%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Talking about this.
We are indeed.
It is the most read story on the Bloomberg, and it takes us back to 1999. And Carol, how possibly stock market history is repeating itself.
Yes, and as Bloomberg's Alexandra Semenova reports and writes, it's been about 25 years since Wall Street had a serious bear hunt. We're talking about bearish strategists. It's kind of a no-no right now. It appears another bear hunt is starting up now. She is, of course, Bloomberg News equities reporter. As we said, the most read story on the Bloomberg on this Friday. She joins us in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Yeah, I remember 1999, and there are points in market history, right, where the bears, they have a very tough time. They stick to their guns, and then it doesn't always work out for them.
Yeah, well, it's very cliche, but they say that history doesn't repeat, it rhymes, and it certainly feels that way when you look back on that time. You know, and what better day to talk about 1999 than today when the S&P just hit its 38th closing record of the year. It feels like things are just going up and up and up, and that's obviously making it a very, very challenging time to go against the market. We saw that, of course, last week with news that Marko Kolanovic is departing JP Morgan after 19 years, and to a lot of people across Wall Street, that resembled the departure of Charles Clough from Merrill Lynch back in 1999.
Okay, remind us who he was for people who weren't following the market. You said, Carol, you've interviewed him before.
Yeah.
Remind us who he is.
Yeah, so at the time, you know, Merrill Lynch was the largest brokerage firm in the U.S. He was their top investment strategist. He was there for 12 years, and he left the firm after that time, after being bearish for 2 years in a row and not getting it right as the market was soaring. It returned 220% between 1995 and 2000, and he turned bearish just as things really started accelerating. And then lo and behold, March 2000 comes, and the bubble starts to deflate, and he looked very vindicated. So the conversations right now happening across Wall Street are, is Marko Kolanovic leaving a sign of the top? Now, it's unclear at this point whether it was his own decision to leave or whether, you know, JP Morgan kind of pushed him out after 3 years of wrong calls. But the takeaway here is not really what happened internally, but that this is just something that tends to happen during market mania. We do see bearish voices either leave their jobs or get kind of vilified. You know, earlier this year, Mike Wilson at Morgan Stanley, another prominent bear, he lost his role as chair of the Global Investment Committee after 10 years. And ever since, he's been a lot less bearish. He's notably tuned down, you know, the warnings that he was known for last year, calling for a 20% drop. We haven't really heard those bold takes from him.
Yeah, I've had conversations with strategists who are bearish, and in a shop where they're like, after a while, there's pressure certainly on them to maybe change their tune, especially when you see a market that continues to march higher.
Indeed. Yeah, I had the great privilege of talking to a lot of Wall Street veterans for this story. One of them was David Rosenberg, who, of course, was famous economist at Merrill Lynch ahead of the global financial crisis. He started sniffing out trouble in 2006, and he said that his employers were very dissatisfied with him. He said that there were times he thought he was going to get fired, but he was ultimately right. And he said that it gets very uncomfortable to go against the grain. And there is a lot of pressure to be bullish, especially when things are just moving up and up.
Absolutely.
What happens historically to those folks who do lose their jobs, but they do end up being right, whether it's, you know, 6 months or 2 years later?
Well, you know, unfortunately, I guess it's not a good time for anyone because there's no room for a victory lap for them because no one wants to predict a crash. Typically, I guess a lot of them tend to open up their own shops. David Rosenberg is one of them. Adam Parker at Trivariate Research was a prominent strategist at Morgan Stanley. He left the firm perhaps for different reasons, but also opened up his own firm. You have Ed Yardeni, who was a prominent strategist at a lot of the big banks, who did open up his own firm. He was bullish, though. But typically, it is a trajectory when you become a very well-known forecaster on Wall Street that you often leave the firms and you do kind of run your own shop and have a little bit more flexibility in your calls.
You have another name in the story, Gail Dudak, who also we used to talk to pretty regularly, very prominent in terms of, yeah, absolutely. Tell us about her story and her view.
So she was a prominent strategist at a firm that was since acquired by UBS. She was one of the 10 elves on Louis Rukeyser's show, A Wall Street Week on PBS. And
now our show.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Which you can catch tonight at 6 p.m.
Exactly. And so she was one of the 10 elves, I believe she said, for something like 20 years. And then in November 1999, she abruptly got kicked off of his elves index for being too bearish. And of course, she ended up being right. And that was another indication where she didn't leave her job, but she did kind of lose part of her role on this prominent TV show.
Quick note, elves was his nickname for the cohort of technical analysts who appeared regularly on his program, as you write, Alex, in the piece.
It's so interesting because we used to, I think, more aggressively, in terms of covering the markets, do a lot of bull-bear debates. There were often a lot of bulls out there. There weren't a lot of bears. They were very well known. It was kind of a small, I feel like, school of strategists and market watchers. But it's kind of interesting that, you know, it's sometimes so tough to have the bearish view or the short view on the market, although it's part of the trade.
Exactly. We're not seeing those bull bear debates anymore. I mean, it kind of feels like everyone has gotten on the same side of the boat. At the top of my head, I'm thinking of Julian Emmanuel, who was on the show earlier today. His target was 4750 on the S&P 500. Up until recently, he kind of did an about face, and now he has the highest forecast on Wall Street, 6,000. It just gets to a point where you can no longer go against this momentum that is inevitably going to go up. And the question is, you know, not whether, you know, this bubble is going to burst or not. It's the fact that there are some characteristics of a bubble, but bubbles can inflate for a very long time before they burst. And a lot of people that I talk to say, yes, we acknowledge that there are some similarities to the past, but it feels a little bit more like 1995 than it does like 1999 at this point.
I would argue the same thing. Like, I feel like 1999, there were just these companies that really had no fundamentals behind them. They threw .com on every name. You had analysts really being very aggressively bullish on so many different names. It just feels very different.
Alex, you've got this great chart in the piece that talks about when Kalanovic turned bearish. September of 2022, almost at the bottom. He turned bearish. The S&P 500 is up 56% since then.
Yeah, it's really, really tough when you are the top voice at a big bank like that and you get it so wrong. Now, to be clear, he is a brilliant guy. He has a PhD in theoretical physics. He has the nickname Gandalf for getting a lot of really great calls for many, many years, but he's had somewhat of a losing streak in the last 3 years. First, being bullish throughout 2022's route and then being bearish for the last 2 years.
Often it's like you're only as good as your last call.
Exactly.
And it's amazing how the sentiment can change. Alexandra, thank you so much. Alexandra Semenova, Bloomberg News equities reporter. As we said, it's the most read story on the Bloomberg on this Friday.
Oh, they don't call him Gandalf, but he's got one. He's known by one name, and that is none other than Elon. You thought I was going to say Kurt Wagner, right?
Did,
yeah, you're giving me this look like, well, who is she going to call Gandalf?
Where are you going?
Yeah.
Well, 6 months ago, executives from Elon Musk's X went to CES, the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, announced that the company was leaning heavily into highly produced, star-driven video. X announced new shows with ex-CNN star Don Lemon, sports broadcaster Jim Rome, and former U.S. Representative Tulsi Gabbard.
The optimism, it seems, was premature.
Like, they were like, okay, this is what we're going to do.
Yeah, these are the words of Kurt Wagner, Bloomberg News technology reporter. He writes about this in the Bloomberg Tech Daily newsletter, which you can sign up if you go to bloomberg.com/technology. Kurt also wrote the book on Twitter, now X, called Battle for the Bird, Jack Dorsey, Elon Musk, and the $44 billion fight for Twitter's soul. He joins us from Denver. So, Kurt, a few years ago in journalism and media circles, there was this idea that all these news organizations were pivoting to video. It didn't go so well for the news organizations when Facebook changed its algorithm. How's it going for the company formerly known as Twitter?
Yeah, well, the pivot to video is still happening, to be clear, but the pivot to professional, high quality, the video, the kind of stuff you might see on like a Netflix or Amazon or something like that, that is where things are really, bleak, quite frankly. You talked about the team from X being at CES and talking up, hey, we have these partners, they're going to be producing exclusive stuff for us. Get in line to advertise on these things. And 6 months later, Don Lemon is out. We saw that very publicly a couple months ago. Tulsi Gabbard has not published any shows. Jim Rome, I was watching his show yesterday. No ads throughout the whole thing that I saw. So it's just like, I think they really just overpromised on this thing. And my understanding from a source that I spoke with is that they're having trouble selling these products. And when there's not advertiser demand, they don't have the money to keep them going and keep everyone interested. And so it feels to me like these things are kind of falling by the side right now.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Earlier we talked with our Ed Ludlow about the anti-Elon consumers who don't want to buy a Tesla, so then they're looking at Rivians. And so I do think about the platform. There are a lot of folks who have left the platform in a big way, and advertisers, I feel like, are very, very much gun shy. Any of us who've been in this media broadcast know how often you get a sponsor and all of a sudden a show's created. Like, that's how it works. It's as simple as that. So is that kind of bottom line, Kurt, why you're not seeing more development on the platform?
I think so, because as you mentioned, right, like we're in this business as well. You know, we've all been in meetings where it's like, hey, we want to do this thing as long as we can find somebody to fund it, right? And usually, if there is an advertiser on board, someone who's going to really, you know, be the tentpole kind of sponsor of an event, it usually does get done, or at the very least, like you give it an effort. And so the fact that these things are sort of just, you know, they were announced and nothing has become of them, to me is a sign that they're just not appealing to an advertiser. Now, of course, that could still change. They're still announcing these, to be clear. They just announced they're going to do something with Khloe Kardashian. When Linda Yaccarino, the CEO of X, was in Cannes last month, she said, hey, we want to get into like sports documentaries and things like that. So it's possible there could be some in the future that do land, but I think the ones they've announced thus far have mostly fallen flat.
Is this, Kurt, slowing down Elon's ambition for X to be the everything app?
I think 100%, right? Because part of everything is entertainment. And so I think they had this idea that not only would you go there to maybe get news or to, you know, scroll through and read about a topic you care about, but you would go there to be entertained, and you would go there to watch a video. And video is very lucrative, right? If you find good video and good video advertisers, that's a great business. That there's a reason everyone was pivoting towards that, right? And so I think that, you know, they hoped that this would sort of become a tentpole part of the app and the experience, and it hasn't thus far. And I want to point out one other thing too, which is like, not only are these deals falling apart, the product has not been built to support this either, right? There was a lot of talk earlier this year, hey, we're going to have a video tab, like a dedicated spot where you could go in and there would be the library of high quality video. That hasn't materialized yet either. So not only are the deals not seemingly struggling, but we don't have the product to showcase whatever they do get. And I think that's a problem as well.
Hey, Kurt, just got about a minute left. You know, of course, Twitter no longer a publicly held company. We know it was taken private by Elon. Having said that, do we know anything about whether advertisers generally are any coming back? I think it's an election year. There would be a lot of activity considering this election cycle on the platform, and yet it's very different because of Elon.
Yeah, I mean, we only sort of know anecdotally, but my understanding is that things have sort of been, you know, at a still but not growing pace for some time, right? I mean, it wasn't that long ago, maybe 6 months, 7 months ago, that Elon told advertisers to go F themselves, right? I mean, that's the kind of thing that reverberates and lasts for a long time. We know last year was a really tough year. I just don't get the sense that there's a lot of incentive right now for advertisers to go back.
Advertisers go find yourselves?
Yeah, I'll let you guys fill in the blank. I'll let you guys fill in the blank,
So,
but, you know, I think you can probably get there.
It's hard not to laugh with a comment like that, because this is a platform,
It's the CEO,
Kurt,
right?
that is supposed to be supported by advertisers, and then also the subscriptions. But I mean, this is the world we live in, no?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, talk about shooting yourself in the foot. I think it was arguably one of the biggest, you know, self-owns that we could have seen from Elon, and I think they're still probably struggling for it.
Really fascinating. Hey, listen, Kurt, thank you so much. We were really hoping to get to this story, so glad you were around to do it. Bloomberg News technology reporter Kurt Wagner joining us there in Denver.
Hey, check out his book. Again, it is the definitive book on Twitter, Battle for the Bird, Jack Dorsey, Elon Musk, and the $44 billion fight for Twitter's soul.
All right, folks, quick check on the markets, and you've got a rally underway. We're pretty much hovering near our best levels of the session, so that means we're up more than 1% in both the S&P and the NASDAQ. Coming up next, we get into NATO.
It's 3:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. 39 minutes to go until that closing bell clangs on Wall Street, wrapping up a winning week for the U.S. stock market. S&P could see its 38th record